1.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is now time for the most disruptive show covering news and events from these great states as well across the globe. Starting today from the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines. In the news, and we're going to start with COVID news. Doses of the first COVID vaccine in the UK were administered on Tuesday after British regulators gave an emergency authorization to the drug produced by Pfizer and biotech. The first 800,000 doses are allocated to people over 80 and who are either hospitalized or already have outpatient appointments scheduled, along with nursing home workers. Others will have to wait, likely into the next year as the UK gets more doses. The vaccine by Pfizer and BioNTech is still being reviewed by the United States and other European countries. Russia had a COVID-19 vaccine registered for emergency use back in August called Sputnik V. Russian health workers have been getting vaccinated in tandem with the official trials for several months. Teachers have been eligible also, and VIPs, including President Putin's own daughter, have had the jab. The list is said to have totaled more than 100,000 people. Sputnik V, or 5, offers 95% protection against the coronavirus. Quote, "We hope the vaccine is effective, but it's difficult to trust some of the figures," unquote, argues Svetlana Zavidova, whose organization monitors clinical trials in Russia. Quote, "We don't see the point of such a rush, other than announcing how we beat the rest of the world." End quote. Zavidova says, quote, "I think there's a struggle between scientists and politicians, and the latter are winning," unquote. Yes, that's true. But that doesn't mean the vaccine is not effective. Both of those things are true. Meaning, if they put a vaccine out and that vaccine wasn't effective, it is more of a blow to national pride as opposed to not being able to win. Getting ahead is important, yes, for political reasons. There's this kind of thing, just like there used to be at chess, where nations are competing with one another. We have a multipolar world, and in the competition between those nations, your ability to deal with a crisis and the competence associated with you dealing with that crisis matters. It plays into public perception and whether or not you're a competent leader and whether or not your country is on the up, or whether you're the sad man of the world or an aging empire. What do you think, Shane? Do you think that the prestige of this is something that matters, as opposed to it being just a scientific endeavor? Or do you think it's both, like I think?
I think it's both. There also is a monetary element to this as well, as far as I can tell, with different companies from different countries selling the vaccines to other countries. But yeah, there's prestige, and then in the long run, I mean, what is prestige really? Prestige it's a sort of show of ability, like you were saying. In some sense, it can be seen as a stress test, but you're also just publicly displaying what you are capable of. in a difficult time, and especially going into another century where what's probably going to be most prized is the ability to act decisively and resiliently in sort of chaotic situations as technology is changing stuff and as new types of threats are being opened up to the world. Who can respond most effectively to this is definitely, that's going to be readily apparent to anybody who's taking notes. And I'm sure there are many, many powerful entities taking notes. So
I would say this: China has seemed to be a competent actor. Russia has seemed to be a competent actor. Iran, believe it or not, in its dealings with the United States in the way it had to play politics. Because emotionally, it's not necessarily easy when somebody is attacking you and you can't respond in this kind of equal measure. You have to pick your points where you respond. That takes a certain degree of competent leadership. I guess it's like dealing with a tiger, right? The people who are dealing with it got to be competent, otherwise the tiger is going to eat them. The tiger has a little bit more leeway in the way that it behaves, but it is not immune and can fall just like anybody else. But no, this is interesting. And by the way, that was you who said that. You made that great analysis. I think this was months ago. And I was like, Shane is absolutely and entirely right. This really does get to the competence of things. And it's a prestige war, just like it was at chess. But it's not just chess. At this point, with a multipolar world, you have all of these things that seem to be up for grabs for this kind of propaganda war. And competence is one of those elements. So, yeah. In the United States, many coronavirus pandemic emergency relief benefits are set to expire at the end of the month. The list include the following: Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. This program extended regular unemployment insurance from 26 weeks to 39 weeks, affecting about 4.6 million out of work people. Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. Independent contractors, self-employed, and gig workers and other workers who don't qualify for unemployment benefits got up to 39 weeks of unemployment insurance under the CARES Act, affecting about 7.3 million workers. Paid leave protection. Under the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act, certain employers are required to give time off to people who are caring for others who are sick themselves. Renter eviction moratorium. A health order from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention allowed tenants nationwide who met certain conditions to give their landlords signed declarations to temporarily stop evictions or take sworn testimony in court. That doesn't mean those landlords cut down the costs. It doesn't mean they gave them a break on those costs. It doesn't even mean that the amount of money that they need to pay has gone anywhere. It just means that they wouldn't be kicked out of their house. That's coming to an end. Home foreclosures and evictions moratorium. For homes with federally backed mortgages from Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, foreclosures were suspended for single-family homes and for evictions from properties that were already foreclosed but still had people living in them. Student loan deferment. Student loan deferments were set to expire December 31st, but they were extended Friday by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos to January 31st. Penalty-free retirement withdrawals. The CARE Act allowed for penalty-free early withdrawals from 401k and IRA retirement accounts up to $100,000. The normal 10% penalty was waived, and there were no mandatory withholding requirements. Yeah, think of that. All of that was under a Republican administration. Trump advocated for the $1,200, while the Democrats were basically saying, yeah, we disagree with that. Are you unclear why Donald Trump overperformed? Think of who this affects. Are you insane to believe, or are you insane? You would be insane to disbelieve that the American public that is reeling from multiple crises is not expecting, believing, wants the federal government and the social safety net that we pay into with the energies, mental and physical, from the jobs that we do, not to mention our taxes. We have the expectation that those things will come back in a time of emergency and a time of need. Donald Trump, Republican in office, Republican Senate, delivers. Whether you think it's not enough is almost less relevant to the fact they delivered. Now, Nancy Pelosi holds up a relief package, coronavirus relief package, under the belief that this is going to hurt Trump. But it's very possible that all of this stuff that passed, the American public recognized that Trump was president because of it, and during the time it happened. It is possible that Trump overperformed because of this. What do you think, Shane? I mean, I honestly think that as I read all this, I think to myself, wow, that's pretty extensive. And this was done under a Republican administration. So what does that look like then when you're making this case of saying, look at all the things we've done? And by the way, Trump was bragging about this. During his election materials, he was bragging about being the president that issued all this. Do you think that this might have been the reason he'll perform? Do you think there might have been something else that was in the mix? I mean, I don't know. I just lean towards this because it seems like it's such direct aid to the American public. And that public understands that that direct aid is given to them by the United States government and by President Trump of that U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, I think that the Democrats, if Hillary had been president, I think that she would have tried to do something similar as well. Now, what this comes back to is the question of whether the Republicans would have let her in the same way that the Democrats didn't want to let the Republicans do a lot of stuff. I think the Republicans would have tried to hem in Hillary more than the Democrats tried to hem in Trump. That's one way of looking at things. So I think in some sense, she might have been able to do more. Whether she would have is another matter entirely. And in some sense, we're going to get a test for that going into 2021. We're going to see how this all works out because by appearances, by what Fauci and other sort of leading figures in the coronavirus response team are saying, this virus is not done. It's not going to just because the vaccines are getting rolled out in spring and, we have some reason to be optimistic potentially about that. Doesn't mean that means that it's all over.
Basically, Biden is going to have to deal with it. And he's going to have to show his competence in this situation.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we're going to get to see that A/B test. Now we're going to be in a different situation. Everybody will have had more time to learn and respond, and also be sort of set in their responses. It's another way of looking at this. We might get a little bit stagnant in terms of how we're able to deal with it. Early on in a crisis, is just this massive disjuncture in how you're going to respond to it. If you look at Sweden versus South Korea versus Taiwan versus Italy, massively different courses there. Yeah. But once you get into it, the institutional momentum builds up, and it becomes hard to change course. And so anyway, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
All right. The Virginia Military Institute removed the statue of Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson from its Lexington campus on Monday following allegations from black cadets of racism at the school. That's funny. You guys are being racist, so let's remove that statue. Complying with a recent court order, the Trump administration on Monday, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security said it would administer the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program under the guidelines crafted by the Obama administration in 2012. Starting Monday, DHS said it would grant approved applicants work permits and deportation referrals that last for 2 years and allow DACA holders to request permission to travel abroad under certain circumstances. The restoration of Mr. Obama's signature immigration policy mandated by a federal judge in Brooklyn on Friday is a major victory for more than 640,000 current DACA recipients, as well as an estimated 300,000 undocumented immigrant teenagers and young adults who could be eligible to apply for the program. Newly elected Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascon announced sweeping plans for criminal justice reform as he was sworn in on Monday. Gascon announced he is immediately ending the cash bail system, adding that experts believe hundreds of incarcerated individuals would be eligible for release tomorrow under a new pretrial release policy. He said his office will also roll out the plan to eliminate all bail in the nation's most populous county beginning January 1st, 2021. Gascon also said his office of prosecutors will no longer seek death penalty in any cases brought to his office. Instead, he pledged a commitment to resentencing those currently on death row to life in prison. Among other proposed changes, the new district attorney said he would immediately end the practice of charging juveniles as adults, striking it down as traumatic and dehumanizing when they were put in a concrete box. He plans to reopen dozens of fatal officer shooting cases dating back as far as 2012. Gascon also said his office will begin reevaluating the sentences in Los Angeles County of anyone who has served more than 20 years in state prison because they are at low risk of reoffending. He will also end the use of sentencing enhancements, which typically add more time behind bars to people who are gang members or to those who used a firearm during the crime. The Trump administration continues to push a series of punitive measures against the Chinese government. In the latest move on Monday, the U.S. State Department announced new sanctions against 14 officials on China's top legislature, the National People's Congress Standing Committee over National Security Law imposed on the financial hub, Hong Kong. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs Group, Inc., is moving to acquire 100% ownership of the securities joint venture in China, deepening its investment in the world's second largest economy after partnering with a domestic brokerage for 17 years. Quote, 100% ownership of our franchise on the mainland represents a significant commitment to an investment in China, unquote. Chief Executive David Solomon, Chief Operating Officer John Waldron, and Chief Financial Officer Stephen Scheer said in the memo dated Tuesday. Australia is to introduce a bill into Parliament that will force Facebook and Google to pay news outlets for featuring their journalism. The Australian government said the World First Law would mandate a process for news outlets to negotiate fair payment for their work. The bill will be introduced into the House of Representatives on Wednesday, but is unlikely to be passed until next year. Australian print media has seen 75% decline in advertising revenue since 2005, the government said. Several Australian news outlets have shut down or cut jobs this year. If the tech giants fail to comply, they face penalties of up to 10% of Australian turnover, or triple the benefits they receive. You know, they could also just stop operating in Australia. And then what would Australia do? Also, one last point to this. This is a fascinating bill. What is that going to have? What effect is that going to have on us? People who do content creation. We already get our channel shut down when we try to show video content and something like that. They're basically going to, that's only going to roll downhill. Let's do this. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There's one more here that I just get to real quick. Uber is selling its driverless car subsidiary to startup Aura Technologies. Aura, founded in 2017, said the deal will help it accelerate its mission to make self-driving cars a reality. Uber will invest $400 million in Amazon-backed company, giving it a 26% stake. That is massive.
That's a big deal.
That is a very big deal.
Uber's taken a step back from self-driving, selling it to an Amazon-owned company. So as far as I can tell, there are really three main contenders. There's Google, Amazon, and Tesla.
Yeah.
And Tesla just through the fact that they are car manufacturers, and you're talking about prestige earlier. People buying a Tesla, that's a kind of a prestigious car.
It is.
They've successfully done that. I think they're definitely in the lead, but in the rear, not too far behind them, you have Google, Amazon, and not Uber at this point.
And by the way, I wouldn't count Google out. I just wouldn't count them out. There's so much money back in that company. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm sure we'll get back to that one a little bit later because that is a fascinating development. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with a monologue in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio right now, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. Definitely smash the subscription button. If you're on a particular site, just make sure that you are subscribed and hit the bell. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I wanted to start this morning by doing kind of a perusal of our political space. because I think we are in fascinating times. And things that happen don't just happen. Fortunately, as human beings with a consciousness, there's meaning in the way that those things, there's meaning in the reason that those things happen in the first place. Let's start here. Donald Trump has, up to this point, abdicated all responsibilities in that office, or seemingly so. He's lost the drive of it, the energy of it, of being the president. Even in giving a medal, he can't be seen to be bothered to gin up the strength and the energy necessary to even do that. Let's play the clip. This is Trump giving a guy a medal and then wandering off before the medal ceremony is even over with. Let's play the clip.
Mr. President, one more question about the inauguration. Thank you very much. Congratulations, sir. Don.
Basically, Donald Trump waving and walking off, and the guy hunching his shoulders like, yeah, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what this is about. And people just kind of applauding like, oh, okay. He doesn't even have the energy in him to do that. The reporter was asking him a question. He just wandered off. Then you get to somebody like Nancy Pelosi, super duper genius, mastermind. Nancy Pelosi. What is Nancy Pelosi doing right now? Nancy Pelosi spent the last several months during a time where the American public was in dire straits arguing with the president of the United States. The president, Republican, offered 1.8 trillion in stimulus. Nancy, 2.2. And I will not settle for $1 less. And Nancy Pelosi, despite the public hurting and aching, despite those small businesses closing, something to the tune of like 40%, despite Nancy Pelosi in California having bread lines that go for miles, with people being in those lines for hours, praying just for some morsel of meat, while Nancy Pelosi dances around in her huge kitchen with her $12,000 pair of refrigerators. Nancy Pelosi turns around once Biden is elected and accepts less than $1 trillion. Think about that. She would not accept anything less than $2.2 trillion. Biden gets in office, she accepts less than $1 trillion. And Nancy Pelosi, super duper mastermind, super duper genius, super duper, mastermind, Nancy Pelosi, is now out here explaining how accepting less than $1 trillion is somehow better than the 1.8 trillion that Donald Trump was offering her. And the honest reason is it's worth it because Biden is in office. That's the honest reason. And she even alludes to it when she's talking about it. Biden is in office. We have a COVID vaccine. We can accept this. Well, the truth of the matter is the COVID vaccine would have been there regardless. Biden might have won that election regardless. You abdicated your responsibilities to this nation and instead did responsibilities that were associated with your party. It is a party function to try to not allow a deal to ding the other guy. That's an issue of party. That is a party crashing the system itself to hurt the other guy. And while you could say, yes, that's politics, there is a secondary responsibility, and I would say primary responsibility, that you're in that office for the welfare and the benefit of the public, and you chose not to do that for political gamesmanship. So now, super duper genius Nancy Pelosi is trying to explain how receiving less than $1 trillion is somehow better off than 1.8 trillion that Donald Trump was offering. Oh, it's fascinating politics. Fascinating. We move to AOC, who's out here pushing a propagandistic narrative of imperialists. No, seriously, arguing about the Maduro election and giving this thing that would sound like any particular neocon or any liberal that would give this message on Maduro, despite being elected, as an authoritarian state. I mean, it's utterly astonishing. He got elected. The United States was investing itself into Juan Guaido to overturn that country violently, going so far as to give a company a contract that would have allowed it to basically murder and massacre, giving her a free pass in doing so. But you believe Maduro is authoritarian, despite the fact that the fascists were trying to take down a legally elected government. Great. Then we have Chuck Schumer. Now, Chuck Schumer is doing something utterly and entirely fascinating. He is setting himself on fire for attention for Joe Biden. Now, how is he setting himself on fire for attention? He wants help. Help me, dog. Help me. Please, Joe Biden, look my way. Show me some legs. Say something to me. Why? Chuck Schumer is pushing this notion of lobbying Joe Biden to say something about student loans. That when Joe Biden gets in office, with a wave of his magic hand, that he would get rid of and eliminate $50,000. Now, yes, he could do it all, but Chuck Schumer's a Democrat, and so this notion of having means tested and eliminating people from it, et cetera, that's what you get. But he is fighting and lobbying hard for this. Let's play the clip of Chuck Schumer, and I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to explain what this means. Let's play the clip.
Senator Elizabeth Warren and I, who are carrying this bill in the Senate, and Congressman-elect Jones, Torres, and Bowman in the House, we have come to the conclusion that the President Biden can undo this debt, can forgive $50,000 of debt the first day he becomes president. You don't need Congress. All you need is the flick of a pen. And President-elect Biden, then President Biden, can make this happen. That's what we are urging to do. We are urging him to choose a Secretary of Education who will do this too, because it's up to the Secretary of Education officially. But if President Biden wants it, I'm sure it will happen. As I said, this debt is a huge burden on the backs of our students, standing in the way of them and their economy, and it stays with them for a very long time.
Let's stop here.
So,
why do you think
the head of this new administration
Chuck Schumer is all of a sudden so hopped up about student debt? Why is he so animated about student debt? Why does this burn into Chuck Schumer now? Does it have anything to do with the potential of Democrats picking up the Senate? That there are 2 Senate seats that are left. And if they get those 2 Senate seats, Chuck Schumer, who's a minor fiddle in the Senate, will become a major fiddle in a do-nothing Senate. He's sick of playing second fiddle to Mitch McConnell. He's tired of Mitch McConnell holding that over him, the power where he can only do nothing but just accept his lot. Now, once he gets in, the catch becomes, does he really do it? And what's interesting here is he even abdicates responsibility to do it himself. Isn't that interesting? Because he's saying not to mandate it by law, but for Biden to just wave his hand. Wave his hand. And if Biden can do that, Chuck, why do we need you? Why do we need you to win in the Senate if Joe Biden can do that with a wave of his hand? No, what he wants is the attention. He wants people to see him saying it. He wants those kids and those students to think Chuck Schumer is so progressive that I'm going to go out and I'm going to run and I'm going to vote for Chuck Schumer. I'm going to vote for the Democrat so Chuck Schumer can be majority leader. I'm going to vote for the Democrat because they're going to wipe away my student debt. Now, this is interesting on so many levels. Why are you doing this, Chuck? And if you're doing this now because you want people to vote for you, isn't this a tacit admission, an outright admission that it's popular? Isn't this an outright admission that the policy is popular? Is this not a repudiation of the way Joe Biden ran his campaign, of the way Nancy Pelosi, for the most part, campaigned? Whereas this euphoric expansionist policies that are not just right politically because they deal with the public's need. They're ethically right, morally right. The notion that you can't pass a Medicare for all, the notion that you're equivalent, talking about $50,000 when you can just get rid of all of it. And the idea that you have to push and set yourself on fire for Joe Biden to give you the minimalist of attention. The minimalist of attention. These guys are talking about austerity. The task force that they've talked about, they've already dashed it. They've already made the point to Wall Street that don't pay attention to anything that we said to Elizabeth Warren and Sanders. We did that to get elected. Now we're in office. They've already made that choice. The people who they're selecting, Neera Tanden, gets across very specifically what that administration is looking for. Not to mention the creatures from the various industries like Raytheon or the oil and gas industries that Joe Biden is filling his campaign up with. Swamp creatures, goblins of the worst nature. But Schumer has to set himself on fire for this. What Schumer acknowledges in doing this is that those policies are in fact popular. And if Joe Biden would have pushed those policies, they might have taken the Senate and they might have taken more seats in the House. What do you think, Shane? Am I onto something for this? Or am I just missing it?
I guess. Wait, why are you saying that Schumer's setting himself on fire?
I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean he's trying to draw attention to himself.
During the Vietnam War.
No. I just mean he's trying to draw attention to himself. I don't mean it in a bad way.
I see. Yeah, or a good way, because I mean, not trying to say that setting yourself on fire is good, but there's an act of moral purity to, self-sacrifice and trying to bring attention to yourself in that way. I get it. But I mean, swamp creatures will do what swamp creatures will do from A to B to Z. What do you see Schumer like? It's almost, I guess I'm confused because it's almost like you've been painting him as not just trying to get attention from himself, but like finally trying to do something, finally trying to actually get the help that Americans need.
I think
but
he just wants to pay attention for himself
posturing?
because I think he wants to be majority leader of the Senate. And if people can see him doing it and they can see him talking about it, maybe those kids will show up and vote for Joe Biden. I think it's that. I think he wants to be majority leader in the Senate. And I think the 2 seats are up in Georgia. And for the first time, you have a Democrat that won Georgia. Those seats are eligible. And you have Democrats in one race is winning and the other race is down by like 1 point. All hands should be on deck. But they're not. Schumer's like out here by himself screaming this. Like, I got to be honest, this is in part of the Democrats' problem. Everybody should be on deck to try to win those 2 seats if you're a Democrat. Schumer shouldn't be out here doing this by himself, screaming at the height of his lungs, for somebody to pay attention to him. Why wouldn't Biden be talking about this at this point? Especially taking the cue from his fellow corporate Democrat, Schumer. No, it's not that I think they're doing it because they love or want to help. I think they're doing it because they want the Senate. That's my thought.
Why do you think we've got to go into a break? But why do you think Biden's not
That's
going
the
in
interesting part, right? Because I don't think Biden is just that guy. I don't think he believes in that stuff. I mean, Biden spent 47 years in the Senate trying to cut Social Security, trying to pass a balanced budget amendment, being against, Social Security and those type of things. And so it's like now he's president. He's living in a new world. And it becomes, okay, what do you expect Biden to do? Be something that he's not? I just don't think this is who Biden is. But you're right. Let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. I'm pretty sure we're going to pick this up at 8 o'clock hour. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back with Danny Sjursen in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Sjursen, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Danny Sjursen, retired U.S. Army officer, director of the New Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. Also the author of 2 books, Ghostwriters of Baghdad and Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War. Danny, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm doing good. Glad to be here. Always plenty of breaking news every day that you can and can't prepare for.
It's true. Thank you for joining us, Danny. All right, I'll start it off here. I've got a couple of articles up. I'll start with this one over in SheerPost. This is SheerPost.com. Biden's young hawk, the case against Jake Sullivan. In that article, you're talking about who Jake Sullivan looks up to. I want to get into this a bit. The upcoming national security advisor, designated as such at least in the upcoming Biden administration. And what you're talking about with him is when asked who his role model was, Jake Sullivan, could have said anybody, could have said any number of names. He said Harry Truman, and you thought that was interesting, and you were kind of reading into that. What is that? Just a brief background. Of course, Harry Truman, former president, presiding over the end of World War II, dropped a couple of bombs That's how most folks know him. What do you think this means? How do you, when you think of him as a historical figure, institutionally, militarily, presidentially even, what do you think of? And what do you think Jake Sullivan thinks of? Danny?
Well, I think I do read into it, as I'm wont to do. But when I dug into Jake Sullivan as deeply as I did, which is pretty deeply, you find out that it kind of makes sense that he would pick Harry Truman. And, when Jake Sullivan answers a question about who his favorite political figure or his political inspiration is, you can believe that he takes it quite seriously and he thinks it through, because this is the most important thing to him since he was a kid. In that sense, we have a kinship. I mean, he loves this stuff. So Truman is, he's a couple of things, and they're very similar to what Jake is. He's an insider's insider politically. More so than Jake, Truman comes from the Kansas City Prendergast machine, which is kind of this old school, smoke-filled room, cigar-chomping insider politics. He is really kind of the archetypal liberal hawk as they start using the term really in some ways around Truman. And the whole idea is that, look, you've got to be as tough as the conservatives, as tough as the Republicans, and foreign policy toughness should actually be the sphere of the Democrats, right? So Truman is that guy. And in a lot of ways, he misreads everything about the Soviet Union during the, aftermath and the end of World War II, and is himself, partly responsible for taking this Cold War to new heights and, making it worse. I mean, there's a lot of things about Truman, but I think that because he epitomizes Democrat toughness, I do think that that's what Sullivan likes about Truman.
We also should be aware that Truman dropped the bomb on Japan when he didn't need to drop the bomb on Japan. I mean, let's be clear. Truman was put in under, as opposed to, I think it was his Transportation Secretary, Henry Wallace, if I'm not mistaken. Henry Wallace was the opposite.
Right.
Bright, well-liked, popular, and a full-blown lefty, especially on the notion of foreign policy. And so Truman, whereas Truman basically took us into the Cold War, where there was an opportunity for some level of relation, Wallace was shafted. I mean, but it's also interesting, Truman didn't have to drop that bomb. I mean, at that point, Japan was being attacked by the Soviet Union. They had put out peace feelers. They were busted. And the bombs that were being dropped, I mean, you had a situation where, more homes were being killed and decimated by the firebombs. I mean, there's some of the scenes that these generals are talking about after the firebombing, talking about one of their people get killed as opposed to many of the Japanese were getting killed, the ratio. It's utterly fascinating when you're looking back at the politics of that war, especially immediately in the aftermath towards the end. But you're right, picking Truman is astonishing. Truman dropped the bomb. I mean, can you talk about that? I know I said a little bit about it.
Yes.
But basically, Truman dropped the bomb and took us into what is basically the Cold War mentality that we have today.
Look, the minor matter that Truman was the president of the country that is the only one in human history to have actually dropped atomic bombs on human beings, right? I mean, Harry Truman gave the order to, extinguish, right, babies, right? This is real. Sullivan, I'm quite certain, would actually make the long, tired, well-worn and false argument that, Truman had to drop that bomb or otherwise 1 million American soldiers would have died. Serious scholars, right? Most serious scholars, people who study this, people who actually care about, what actually happened and look at the documents, have, they've been saying that the atomic bomb didn't need to be dropped for the longest time. But that argument, that fact, hasn't really made its way into the general public for the most part. I mean, people just need to, there's so many books, but, John Dower's book, Cultures of War, is just dead on. But the reality is Japan was beat. They were actually giving out feelers through the Soviet Union. The blockade could have just continued. They couldn't really do very much more harm per se. Our submarines had sunk essentially their entire merchant fleet. There was absolutely no need to drop atomic bombs on babies. There just wasn't. And we did. And you know, don't take my word for it. Turns out that there were actually a lot of folks you've heard of who were really opposed to the dropping of the nuclear bomb or the atomic bomb, even if they didn't know it was going to happen. And like, who am I talking about? Well, you know, real doves like Eisenhower, Admiral Leahy, General Douglas MacArthur, Admiral Chester Nimitz, General Hap Arnold, you know, just those doves all thought that dropping the atomic bomb was, you know, not only wrong or unnecessary, but they actually voiced opposition to the use at some point, usually afterwards, because not all of them were told it was going to happen.
Danny, later on in this article, you're talking about how Jake Sullivan, you penned a number of articles, obviously, over the years. Back in 2018, he penned one, and in that article, he was talking about how he wanted to reconstitute an old order with new terms, reconstitute an old American order in new terms. I believe, I'm slightly misquoting this there. I believe this is back in 2018 that he published this. What are those new terms? So I can understand he's talking mid-Trump, during Trump's presidency. As we're shifting away from an order, and we know roughly what the old order is. It's what precedes Trump, 2016 and before. But what are the new terms? How do you think he would try to shift America's standing if he were to take us in a time machine from 2016 to 2020 and sort of reorient on the other side of that gap? Danny, where do you think he'd take us?
Well, yeah, I mean, so he's talks about American exceptionalism, for example, and he says, don't get rid of American exceptionalism, recapture it, and everything that he wrote during the Trump year was this idea that Trump is somehow taking us on this terrible diversion away from our actual values and the right way to do policy. And so Sullivan really would like to see more of the same in terms of like Obama's term, right? So he wants to see tech savvy, advisor heavy kind of interventionism and forward deployment, but with a polite veneer, right? So with an articulate president, sort of some woke language around it, except he would like to go back in the time machine, relive Obama's presidency, but make Obama listen to every single hawkish piece of advice that Hillary gave that he didn't necessarily follow. So that's interesting because he actually, Sullivan, would like to see a Biden administration be an Obama administration where Biden never got listened to. Because I don't think that Biden is a dove, but when he was vice president, he tended to be a little more circumspect about things like Libya, Syria, Yemen, and the Afghan surge that Sullivan, who is a firm and fixed believer in the Clinton hawkishness, Hillary Clinton, would like to have seen happen. So I think he wants to see Obama plus, maybe not quite George W. Bush, but an Obama plus. So when he says we need to like recapture it and we have to have a new way, he just means include our allies when we do indecency. Say the right things about NATO when we do this or that, and get back on track to hyper empire, and don't dare criticize the empire even as you grow it, the way that, say, Trump did, who sometimes said the right things but then didn't follow through. Well, that upset Jake, that Trump would dare even occasionally say, hey, look, maybe there's a revolving door of corruption. Hey, maybe we need to end those wars. Jake doesn't want to hear that. He's opposed to all that. He wants the status quo. He wants polite, woke imperialism, and that's what he wants. That's what he likes, and he wants to lead the whole thing, by the way, because his ambition is staggering.
And that's the worst type of imperialism: woke, polite imperialism. Yes, we're going to take that property. Yes, we're going to steal that oil, but we're going to do so with a smile, and we're going to do so politely. I got to be honest. Between the two, give me Trump. At the very least, you know what you get with Donald Trump, and I suspect that's where a lot of their problems lie. That Donald Trump makes this look basically what it is. And honestly, oddly enough, less hawkish than all of them. Donald Trump didn't start any new wars, even though he brinksmanship, absolutely. He could have sleptwalked us into war, absolutely. but he didn't start any new wars. Danny, I want to bring you back because I want to ask you a very particular question on this notion of whether it's even possible in our current day and age to have a foreign policy that doesn't necessarily a non-interventionist foreign policy. And in that case, would you get kind of a running to the stores? Like if America came out and said, we're having Medicare for all, and they believed that the next administration was going to get rid of it, you might have a rush to doctors. You might have lines coming out of doctors and hospitals because those people are running because they believe that something is going to be taken away from them at some point. And that may level out. Well, with a president only getting 4 years or 8 years, is it possible to have an administration that is, let's say, less hawkish, let's say non-interventionist, without the countries around the world responding to that in a way of, let's say, a certain entrenchment, knowing that America will go back to normal? Let's do this. Let's bring you out. And I want you to think about that, because I think that's a Tulsi Gabbard presidency that people talked about. That's what they hoped for in a Trump presidency. And some people might have even thought Obama's presidency was going to be something like that. So let's go out. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment with Danny Sjursen, retired U.S. Army officer, director of the new Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. Joining us is Danny Sjursen, retired U.S. Army officer, director of the new Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. He is the author of 2 books, Ghost Riders of Baghdad and Patriotic Descent, America in the Age of Endless War. Danny, again, welcome to the show, man. I always enjoy it when you come on. I love these foreign policy talks.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get into a bit of political philosophy, if you want to call it that. Is it possible to have a non-interventionist government? And what would that government look like? And more importantly, or less importantly, or to a minor importance, what will be the response of enemies of this country that we've made over these years? I'm not even saying that enemies shouldn't be our enemies, but I'm saying people and countries that we have ran afoul over all of those years. If the belief is that America is going to go back to its typical foreign policy, how would those countries respond? And if those countries will respond that way, is it possible to have, logically, a compassionate, non-interventionist government?
Well, I think it's exceedingly difficult when the government is structured as it is now. So what I mean by that is we say that we're a democracy, or we say that we're at least a republic, but the American people aren't really involved in foreign policy. They're not even really involved in who's picked and who's approved for foreign policy. So you take somebody like Jake Sullivan on the National Security Council, that's where more and more power has been centralized. That they don't even have to be approved. Sullivan doesn't even have to be approved by the American people. But it's beyond that. I mean, the 4-year terms, I'm not necessarily saying, I'm not calling for a philosopher king like Plato, although I have my moments of guilty pleasure, let's go nuclear option on these things, but I'm not actually calling for that. But the political and partisan whims make it very difficult for there to be any consistency in foreign policy. It makes it very hard for allies or enemies or everyone in the middle to know exactly how to respond to a rather schizophrenic American foreign policy machine in some ways, because of the pivots. But at the same time, the money that is in American politics, the corruption, were it to happen anywhere else, would be considered banana republic, tin pot dictatorship. And it really does dig into American foreign policy, because what you have is the world's biggest gun runner is also the world's largest, or self-styled the world's greatest democracy. That's a fact that the earth has to deal with. That's just an absurdity that is not really talked about. Okay, what else does that mean? Okay, so the number one gun runner in the world is also the one that says it's the indispensable nation of democracy, and it's also highly interventionist and has more overseas expeditionary bases than anyone in the history of the world, and is really the only country that's at war in so many places now and in some ways historically. So there's something driving this, and there really is money behind it. It's not the only thing driving it, but there really is a pecuniary and professional interest of a certain class of people, all of whom are now in the Biden administration. Don't get me wrong, plenty of whom were in the Trump administration, but I think it makes it very difficult, because the American people are generally with us, sort of, or with those of us who are more anti-interventionist. Generally. They don't care a lot, most of them, about foreign policy, but to the extent that they do, when they're asked, they kind of think this is ridiculous. But don't get it twisted. The U.S. government has really never been particularly inclined to follow its people's viewpoints on foreign policy. And the last anecdote that I'll give is about 83% of Americans supported the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, the anti-fascist side. 83%. So how did the American government respond to that? They basically put an arms embargo on both, which was a tacit way of supporting the fascists, and then they let Texaco sell the oil needed to massacre the Republican duly elected government with German tanks and bombs and Italian tanks and bombs. And that's what we did. And that's what FDR did. And they didn't care what the American people thought about it. And that's just generally how it runs. This is very much an imperial system, and it has gotten that way over time, and it's going even more in that direction.
What would it take to get us out of that? It's a pretty high bar to jump. We've been doing it for a long time. There's a lot of money in it, and it's an easy way to sort of funnel money from government into an industry in a way that you can't without nationalizing many of them. So it's just a sort of easy way to make money for people who are attached to the government, attached to the political establishment. But given all that, assuming it would be a good, which I do, to not have that be such a large staple in our economy, how do we get out of that? Is there any feasible path, even if it takes 50 years, for America as a country, besides sheer failure, to stop selling so many weapons, to stop having that be such a big component of how we make money and how we try to stabilize, quote unquote, stabilize our political order internationally? Danny, how do we do that?
Right. I'm really good at identifying problems and terrible at identifying solutions. No, I think that Congress is going to have to come back into the game, and Congress's composition is going to have to completely change. Now, those are two big things, right? So that saying that is easy. Actually doing is another. The American people are going to have to start really electing, okay, or refusing to vote. But eventually really electing folks who are going to take back their constitutional duty on foreign policy, put in place genuine laws, okay, that make it illegal to have this kind of revolving door corruption, and make it illegal to just sell arms at a whim across the world without any oversight. The system exists theoretically to stop all of this. In fact, in many cases, the system was kind of designed to avoid much of this. The founders didn't agree on much of anything, but they mostly agreed that the biggest fear they had, or one of the biggest fears they had, besides their slaves killing them in their sleep, the other big fear they had was that the republic might become an empire. It might go the way of Rome. Okay, the curse of Rome, all this. So a lot of the structures in place, were they to be followed, could avoid some of this. but it's been twisted. And most people haven't particularly cared about that, and then the media is controlled in such a way that they don't even really hear about what we're talking about right now. So, I tend to believe in street activism. I tend to believe in grassroots stuff. I tend to believe that systems have to be stopped when they get too obscene. And I'm not a professional activist type, but I do study it and I dabble. And it does seem to me that the ballot is one way, right? Kind of getting a different sort of person into office, which is going to require rejection of elements of the two establishment parties. But that's not easy, right? Because they give you ham and cheese and they say, look how different these things are. Stopping traffic, believe it or not, has worked over the years. It doesn't always work and it's slow, but I do think there's got to be a degree of citizen grassroots activism that demands something different. And that might not be pretty. And that might not be able to happen from behind your Facebook screen or even behind the voting booths blind. So until we decide, no, we will not elect people who worked for Raytheon or take their money and you name it, until we do that, and until this machine sort of stops, then we are going to keep getting the same thing until there's a nuclear catastrophe brought about by some sort of misunderstanding or provocation probably on our side, but on both sides of whoever has the nuclear weapons, or the climate just burns up, essentially. This is just going to continue and continue. So it's going to be one of those two things, God forbid, or it's going to be a citizen grassroots demand, not an ask, a demand for change, because that's how it's been. It has always been thus. No one gives power away, right? Nobody just gives away their wealth and their power. So, and that sounds pretty radical, but it's actually not. It's just historically how things are done, if they get done at all.
It is literally just politics. And it's something that the left, it's something that people in general have forgotten. Like this notion that Bernie Sanders is pushing, let's say, for Medicare for all, or let's say he's pushing to get the troops out of, Syria or Yemen, and he loses. And apparently those things that he was pushing for just go away the moment he loses. No, they don't go away the moment that you lose. You have 30 million people that are listening to you, that are looking to you for leadership. And if you would say, look, you get our votes when you get those troops out of Yemen, and when that's the policy, when Medicare for all is the main policy, and when XYZ is the main policy, and you basically leverage the mob and the crowd. And this is with a certain political distinctiveness, right? This is not just the crowd out there setting stuff on fire or turning over statues. This is a very specific political intent behind it. And I gotta be honest, Danny, I think we're screwed. Because I don't think, in politics, it seems like the left and Democrats have accepted the argument of you have nowhere else to go. So you get a section of Democrats that just agree. Anything that Obama does is great. I had one guy tell me, a liberal said, Obama's done everything right in that office. Yeah, for you, because you own a company, you're rich. I bet he has. It's this rich liberal thing where the world is great. Everything is fine as long as a Democrat is in office. Doesn't even really matter what the Democrat does. It could be Hillary, it could be Obama, it could be any random Democrat. But in the very specific instance, I think we're screwed. Like, if the public looks at this and says, you have nowhere else to go, so from the standpoint of the ballot box, they feel forced to vote for the Democrat. If the liberal don't care about it, and if it's something like the Vietnam War, where it takes a certain degree of heft and discomfort on the crowd to get it active, then the crowd just seems dejected. I mean, you have, 1-2% of the country that's involved in the military? Am I right about that? I mean, like, how do you get the public involved if the public doesn't care and the public is dejected from all of this?
Look, we're short on time, but I just want to really emphasize how important what you're saying is. Bernie has all these supporters, this base that rejects everything about, just the status quo Obama, the status quo Clinton, Biden team. And those people, enough of them voted for Biden to get him in office again. They held their noses and did it, right? For the 40th time or whatever. And what was their thank you, right? How serious does the DNC administration, that is Joe Biden, because that's what it is, how serious does the establishment Democratic Party take your vote? 30 million Bernie supporters. Well, I'll tell you how serious. Look at the appointments. Look at the incoming foreign and domestic policy folks. They didn't even throw you much of a bone. Your powerful wing of progressive,
Danny,
motivated.
You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, we don't have the time. We're short on time. But you're right, man. You're absolutely right. I always love it when you come on. Danny Sjursen is a retired U.S. Army officer, director of the New Eisenhower Media Network, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and contributing editor at antiwar.com. He is the author of 2 books, Ghost Riders of Baghdad and Patriotic Descent, America on the Edge, in the Age of Endless War. And you can follow him on Twitter at Skeptical Vet and check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill, co-hosted with fellow vet Chris Henriksen. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the news, or the headlines. In the news, doses of the first COVID-19 vaccine in the UK were administered on Tuesday. There we are. Doses of the first COVID-19 vaccine in the UK were administered on Tuesday after British regulators gave an emergency authorization to the drug produced by Pfizer and BioNTech. The first 800,000 doses are allocated to people over 80 who are either hospitalized or already have outpatient appointments scheduled, along with nursing home workers. Others would have to wait, likely into the next year as UK gets more doses. The vaccine by Pfizer and BioNTech is still being reviewed in the United States and other European countries. Russia has a COVID-19 vaccine registered for emergency use back in August called Sputnik V. Russian health workers have been getting vaccinated in tandem with official trials for several months. Teachers have been eligible also, and VIPs, including President Putin's own daughter, have taken the jab. The list is said to include more than 100,000 people. Sputnik V offers 95% protection against the coronavirus. Quote, "We hope the vaccine is effective, but it's difficult to trust some of the figures," unquote, argues Svetlana Zavidova, whose organization monitors clinical trials in Russia. Quote, "We don't see the point of such a rush, other than announcing how we beat the rest of the world. I think there's a struggle between scientists and politicians, and the latter are winning," unquote. Thing is, both of those things can be true. In the United States, many coronavirus pandemic emergency relief benefits are set to expire at the end of the month. The list includes the following: Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, PEUC. This program extended regular unemployment insurance from 26 weeks to 39 weeks, affecting 4.6 million out-of-work people. Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA. Independent contractors, self-employed, and gig workers, and other workers who don't qualify for unemployment benefits got up to 39 weeks of unemployment insurance under the CARES Act, affecting 7.3 million workers. Paid leave protection. Under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, certain employers are required to give time off to people who are caring for or were sick themselves. Renter eviction moratorium. A health order from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention allowed tenants nationwide who met certain conditions to give their landlord signed declarations to temporarily stop evictions or take the sworn testimony in court. Home foreclosure and eviction moratorium. For homes with federally backed mortgages from Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, foreclosures were suspended for single-family homes and for evictions from properties that are already foreclosed but still have people living in them. Student loan deferment. Student loan deferments were set to expire December 31st but were extended Friday by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos to January 31st. Penalty-free retirement withdrawals. The CARES Act allows for penalty-free withdrawals from the 401k and IRA retirement accounts up to $100,000. The normal 10% penalty was waived, and there were no mandatory holding requirements. Shane, that is a lot. And this was put through, again, I emphasize, with a Republican president who himself pushed for the $1,200 before anybody else did. And with the Republican Senate, Mitch McConnell. Now, when people went to the polls and when people were voting, and do you think that this was in their heads? I mean, President Trump sent this out in his mailers. He was bragging about it. Look at what I did. Look at what I did. And when you have a country with, 20 to 40 million people out of a job, you have all of these people that are about to be evicted from their homes and they have no idea where they're going to go. You have people who are ill and sick. Like, you have basically a Republican president and a Republican Senate doing this stuff. Those people had to go to the polls. And did those people associate what was being done with that Republican president, regardless of what the media and regardless of what Democrats were saying? I mean, I know from your perspective, it's Joe Biden is just that bad of a candidate and is that inert of a candidate. But I have to admit, Trump overperformed. And I'm trying to understand why. And it's possible that I don't live in the realm of people that would receive this and identify it with Trump. But there are people who would. And because I don't live there, doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. And so that's where I'm coming at this from and trying to understand, is this the reason why Trump got that many more votes? Because of all those programs that were put in place that I know a lot of people had to associate with him and were thankful for, because any one of them being removed is ruinous. Oh, and yeah, all of those are about to be removed.
As far as I can tell, you got voted out, though. I mean, to answer your question, yes, I know some people who were Trump, on the line about Trump before they'd voted for him in 2016, or they wanted to, or they were, thinking of it, or something like this. But depending on which specific person we're talking about, and then 2020 rolls around, and yes, they voted for Trump. They got their Trump bucks. They got their $1,200 in the mail, and they were like, "Heck yeah, I'm going to vote for this guy," because buying people straight up apparently just does work. On the other hand, Jamarl, I don't think I'll be honest. I still don't think that Trump did enough. And we were talking about this in advance of the election. That not only did he not do enough, or in the early stages of preparation for the virus, but that our political establishment. I'm not trying to single him out because our political establishment as a whole, really, as far as I can tell, is what I would blame. It's not Fauci. It's not Trump. It's not that that sort of stupid dichotomy that seemed to characterize maybe June of this year. It was a lot more than that. But yeah, I mean, earlier on you were asking, going into you weren't asking this, but you were saying, does Trump deserve some of the credit that some people are giving him? Does he deserve to blame? You were looking at this list. This is a decently long list of things that he's done. And again, we don't know what the Democratic alternative would have done, but we're going to have a chance to find out in some sense going forward. And so if we can keep, a level head and look at this, we were talking earlier about the litmus test, the prestige test of different countries developing vaccines for release and how well those different vaccines do and how quickly and widely they can disseminate them. Well, we're going to get another chance to see that a similar parallel test going on in the U.S. when the Democrats come into office and when we see the Republicans start to respond to them. What is Biden going to do? I don't know. What are the Republicans going to do to try to hem him in? I don't know. But we should be watching,
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because ultimately anything that these guys try to do, there's going to be a politics either for it or against it. And so if Biden was in office with the Democratic administration, would he have been able to get this? And if so, how much? Like, I see where you're coming from. No, that makes sense. It's the alternate, what would the alternate have done in that case? Look, either way, I don't think it's enough. Clearly, I don't think it's enough. I just think the American public gets so little under normal circumstances that they were shocked. And oh my God, look at this, $1,000. Thanks, man. Like, I think it was, that type of stuff.
A couple of times too. It was like $1,200 over a couple of different stimulus checks that folks got. So that added up.
Yeah, it did. I mean, in fact, people were getting more than what they were typically getting under their regular jobs, and that created some of the consternation. But we're talking like $100 to $200, and if we're being honest, that literally kept the economy afloat. And so, it's like, get over yourselves on that stuff. The Virginia Military Institute removed the statues of Confederate Thomas Stonewall Jackson from its Lexington campus on Monday following allegations from black cadets of racism at the school. I'm sorry, that one always trips me out. There's racism at the school. Let's get rid of that statue. That's the cause. It's not the statue, man. Doesn't help, but it's not the statue. Complying with a recent court order, the Trump administration on Monday, the United States Department of Homeland Security said it would administer the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program under the guidelines crafted by the Obama administration in 2012. Starting Monday, DHS said it would grant approval applicant work permits and deportation deferrals that last for 2 years, and allowing DACA holders to request permission to travel abroad under certain circumstances. The restoration of Mr. Obama's signature immigration policy, mandated by a federal judge in Brooklyn on Friday, is a major victory for more than 640,000 current DACA recipients, as well as an estimated 300,000 undocumented immigrant teenagers and young adults who could be eligible for the program. Newly elected Los Angeles County Attorney General George Gascon announced sweeping plans for criminal justice reform as he was sworn into office on Monday. Gascon announced he is immediately ending the cash bail system, adding that experts believe the hundreds of incarcerated individuals will be eligible for release tomorrow under the pretrial release policy. He said his office will roll out a plan to eliminate all bail in the nation's most populous county beginning January 1st, 2021. Gascon also said his Office of Prosecutors will no longer be seeking the death penalty in any case brought to his office. Instead, he pledged commitment to rescinding or resentencing those currently on death row to life in prison. Among other proposed changes, the new district attorney said he would immediately end the practice of charging juveniles as adults, striking it down as traumatic and dehumanizing when they are put in a concrete box. He plans to reopen dozens of fatal officer-involved shooting cases dating back as far as 2012. Gascon also said that his office will begin reevaluating all sentences in Los Angeles County for anyone who has served more than 20 years in state prison because they are a low risk to reoffend. He will also use the sentencing enhancements, which typically add more time behind bars for people who are gang members or those who use firearms during a crime, he said. Man, that is significant. And yet, I wonder if it's still not enough to change the character of an individual from our criminal justice system. Oh, God, we got to talk about that. The Trump administration continues to push a series of punitive measures against the Chinese government. In the latest move on Monday, the U.S. State Department announced new sanctions against 14 officials on China's top legislature, the National People's Congress Standing Committee, over a national security law imposed on the financial hub of Hong Kong. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs Group Incorporated is moving to acquire 100% ownership of its securities joint venture in China, deepening its investment in the world's second largest economy after partnering with the domestic brokerage for 17 years. Quote, 100% ownership of our franchise on the mainland represents a significant commitment to and investment in China, unquote. Chief Executive David Solomon, Chief Operating Officer John Waldron, and Chief Financial Officer Stephen Shear said in a memo on Tuesday. Australia is to introduce a bill into Parliament that will force Facebook and Google to pay news outlets for featuring their journalism. The Australian government said the world's first law would mandate a process for news outlets to negotiate fair payments for their work. Fair, whatever that means. The bill will be introduced into the House of Representatives on Wednesday, but is unlikely to be passed until the new year. Australian print media has seen a 75% decline in advertising revenue since 2005, the government said. Several Australian news outlets have had to shut down or cut jobs this year. If the tech giants fail to comply, they would face penalties of up to $10 million or 10% of Australian turnover, or triple the benefits they've received. I got to be honest, this is just capitalism. This is like saying the car owner has to pay the the horse and buggy owner because the horse and buggy owner can't compete with the car. I mean, come on. I don't know if, these things are exactly the same. I think media is important. Don't misunderstand me. But some of these things seem to be just outgrowths of capitalism and outgrowths of the competition within the context of that capitalism. This seems like one of them. Delivering media online is more efficient. Facebook and Google basically present the news media as news media. They're giving you views. Now you want to get money from them. And yeah, I am somewhat concerned about what this means for other people like us who do a channel. Are they also going to try to get money from us for those views? I don't know. I think this is a slippery slope like nobody's business. And I got to be honest, between doing that, Facebook and these other companies might just pull out of Australia. What do you lose in pulling out of Australia? You have the rest of the world. You have billions of people. If anything, Australia is losing out in that process. I don't think Australia is the juggernaut here in this. What do you think, Shane? We have one more story about Uber, but what do you think about this one real quick?
I fall on the same side as you do, ultimately. Yeah, but we can go into the break, but ultimately I fall on the same side as you do. This seems like rent-seeking by the media establishment in Australia. I get it. Another side of this, though, just to sort of add into the devil's advocate position, these are American companies. And so in some sense, Australia is just trying to, hey, don't take our news without paying us some money. Don't try to come into our country. We're not, they're not going to probably make nearly as much profit as Google and Facebook will. These aren't Australian-owned companies. They don't even, it's not like the Australian government has a proportional set of shares that they're going to benefit from the growth of these companies after they come in. It doesn't work like that.
No,
you know what I mean? So I can sort of see it from both angles.
But I do think they want
on the
control.
other hand,
I do think they want control. Kind of like the news media in this country. After Trump got elected, what did they do? They bought Twitter, Facebook, and social media and to browbeat him. Because network news is probably more in line with the kind of perspective that they want to show. And they don't necessarily, they want to hit these guys on the knuckles. I could be wrong. And look, I'm biased, right? Because I think this is eventually roll downhill and affect me. But despite being biased, I could also be right. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Shane. There's a balance to the perspective. That's fair. Last one. Uber is selling its driverless car subsidiary to startup Aurora Technologies. Aurora, founded in 2017, said the deal will help it accelerate its mission to make self-driving cars a reality. Uber will invest $400 million in the Amazon-backed company, giving it a 26% stake. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's do this. Let's go into the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
and we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Phone lines are open. We can have any number of conversations. Jamarl, I'm going to call you out on the spot right here, man. We've talked about this. You've talked about this on the air.
Well, wait. We have a clip. We actually have a clip for this term.
So we have a clip. You want to go into something? Go for it.
Yeah. All right. So, in the monologue, I kind of made mention that what Pelosi is doing, she's trying to make this argument that getting less money is somehow better, when the honest answer is getting less money is better because Joe Biden is in office. That's basically what it boils down to. And all of those millions of people who struggled, all of those businesses that closed, all of those people that went hungry, all of those people in their food lines, it was all worth it because her guy got in office. But AOC is doing something else. AOC is making this safe space argument. I get it. It's basically, what is the argument that I think is safe? What is the level of conversation I think I can have where people in the political establishment won't hit me? And it just so happened to come out in this kind of imperialist propaganda that liberals, or for that matter, neocons will push. Let's play AOC's clip. This is a fascinating clip.
I think he sees himself losing on the issues. He sees himself losing on the wall, and on the wall on the southern border, and he needs to grasp at an ad hominem attack. And this is his way of doing it. But what we really need to realize that what is happening is that this is an issue of authoritarian regime versus democracy. And in order for him to try to, dissuade or throw people off the scent of the trail, he has to really make and confuse the public. And I think that that's exactly what he's trying to do.
Think about that. Think about that. She's talking about a leader in a foreign country, Nicolas Maduro. She's basically making the point that he's a strong man, he's an authoritarian, and is trying to make this argument that this is about democracy and authoritarianism. This is about imperialism and democracy. Let's be very clear. Juan Guaido, the puppet of basically Pompeo and Donald Trump, their guy, their traitor that they dangled in with their hand in the back of his, under his pants, basically a fascist, to take over that country in a hostile military takeover. That is what U.S. policy was. So fervently so that a company was given a contract that was basically going in, attacking military bases, killing people and whatnot, with the idea of installing Guaido, a person that nobody knows, wasn't elected to a pie shop, in as president. Astonishing. And at that point, he's not president. He's basically ruler or dictator. It's a junta, a regime that is propped up by the United States. Because the United States, what would they say after that? Democracy has prevailed. The pro-democratic fascists prevailed. That's what they were going to say. We know what they were going to say. They were going to be perfectly okay with those people getting killed because that's what they've done in other situations where you get kill squads. I mean, when they put Abrams in, what do you think they put Abrams in for? People or policy. And Abrams, war criminal, and yeah, convicted of Congress for lying. He was perfectly okay because he was the man for the job. Shane, did you see this? I mean, this is pretty astonishing. AOC, who's supposed to be a socialist, supposed to be anti-imperialist, is sitting here in this moment. There's another video of her chopping veggies, talking about Maduro and how, he's a dictator and all of this other stuff. And so it's like, are you serious? It's like, are you really pushing this pro-war, pro-regime change argument? I've said nothing about Maduro in regards to whether he's good, bad, indifferent, or anywhere between. My point is, it's none of our business. And the weird aspect that you have friends like this, supposedly anti-imperialist friends like this, given the propaganda line of empire. Oh, astonishing. Astonishing. What do you think about this? I mean, am I putting too much into this? Am I wrong on this? It just seems like I've seen multiple videos of her talking like this, where she's basically talking about Maduro, and she's making this argument about democracy and fascism, or democracy and authoritarianism. And it's like, potentially none of those are on the table. The U.S. tried to install its own guy. The U.S. pushed the people not to participate in the election. Maduro wins the election. Why is this shocking? And why are you giving this line that is basically of empire? What do you think, Shane? Am I putting too much into this? Am I hitting her unfairly on this?
No, you should be hitting her on this. We lost the plot on democracy a long time ago as a country. I don't even want to count how many decades ago at this point. I would need to learn more to do so with some accuracy. But, the fact that we continuously overthrow people, if you're going to overthrow a country who's elected a leader that you don't like, that's not a democracy. That's a putsch. At that point, that becomes just an empire trying to keep the provinces in check, trying to keep their leaders as the leaders of the provinces. There's even deeper down. There's a fundamental contradiction where if you are an empire, if you want to maintain control over these outer fringes that you've managed to take over the years, you can't have them be democracies. There's just a contradiction there, because if they become democracies, if they are democracies fundamentally, then they might try to secede, or they might try to do these other things that push them away from your core of power, from the core of power that you maintain over them. And you don't want that. And if you permit that on the provinces, then bit by bit, they're going to secede. Almost inevitably, it's going to be in their best interest to do so. Especially, once they get enough technology, once they get enough of a base of leadership, once the sort of gap that allowed you to take them over has been equilibrated a bit, they're going to try to push away. And you don't want that as the empire. And so, an empire that's founded on principles of democracy, at least ostensibly, is going to have a hard time as it sees those contradictions start to bear fruit. Now, and I think that by and large, we're one of the first. We might be the first. The Romans, just to be clear, definitely not a democracy. There's some republicanism at the core, but at the fringe is definitely an empire. And it's the same thing with us. We like the veneer of democracy, but when push comes to shove, it is not in our pecuniary interest, to use Danny Sjursen's term. It's not in our pecuniary interest to permit them to do so. And we will inevitably try to bring them back in to keep them from pushing away. And the problem with that, of course, is that in the long run, you undermine your own ideology. You undermine the underpinnings of your own political system, of the political system that, at least ostensibly, is doing its work in that empire's core. If you overthrow a bunch of governments overseas and you start to call into question legitimacy of the democracy, and sooner or later, if you have a political class at home, they're going to want to apply the same principles that they do to those other countries at home. And this is where even this election year, when we're talking about color revolutions, this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of planned uprisings overseas. I'm not saying that that's what happened in 2020. That would be a very controversial conversation, and I don't necessarily believe that. I don't think that it was nearly that well planned out. But a lot of people do think so. And a lot of people, for good reason, looking either at 2016 or 2020, think that in general, both of those elections were attempted coups. Here's the thing. We talk about ideology sometimes. Where are we going to go? Like, we've eroded over the years, over the decades, the thing that's supposed to hold us together as a country. And I don't see anybody on the horizon who has a viable, coherent sort of tradition that can fit with that's supposed to take over where we've now left ourselves. Am I making any sense, Jamarl? I don't know where we're supposed to go. I don't know what the next political ideology is. We've so bought into democracy, but we've so heavily eroded it over the decades that we're kind of marooned.
No, I know what you mean by
from
that.
A political philosophical perspective.
Because basically this country is given a perspective of the world. And in putting that perspective of the world, democracy, we believe in representation of the government. We want self-control, meaning we want governments, this kind of Woodrow Wilson. We want self-determination of the various governments. Now, that in and of itself created conflict. When Europe started redrawing these maps with the idea of, okay, well, we're going to put these groups in with these groups, you realize you ended up with another problem that wasn't there with monarchies. Even though the monarchies, these capitalist countries, end up going to war, you still, in breaking these countries up, created a huge amount of nationalism that ended up still having minorities in those countries. Meaning you were damned if you do, damned if you didn't. And the redrawing of the world under these kind of enlightened eyes, it didn't necessarily solve the issue. It might have made the issue worse. Also, we like democracies in word, not necessarily in deed. I mean, keep in mind, the reason that we toppled many of the governments in South America, Guatemala, Bolivia, I mean, there's a list of these governments, was because they were democracies. They wanted to use the resources of their country, meaning after these kind of labor movements and these banana republics where they were taking bananas out and these companies were buying up energy and buying politicians and buying up areas. They were paying the people not in money, but paying them in tokens that they can use at the general store owned by the company. It was stuff like that was going on. And so you had people marching in these countries, Guatemala, Chile, that wanted liberation. They wanted to use the resources of the country for the country itself. Now, that's a democracy. When you say you want a democracy, that democracy may, in fact, make a decision to use the resources of that country for the people of that country in a way that you don't like. because it's taking it away from your companies, or it's selling to your companies at higher rate so more money can go to the people of that country. That's why we were backing kill squads. That's why we were using the CIA to topple the various governments, meaning it's the Tillerson memo thing. Yes, we like to say we like these things because there has a propagandistic value to it and covering up the actions, meaning the empire doesn't necessarily rule nakedly. To take a Paternity saying of it, Michael Patter, I think it's Paternity of Pateri, whatever. You get my point, that this stuff isn't done nakedly. And so I agree with everything that you just said. And the question becomes, what's next? Where do we go? And is it the thing that's next is a human rights movement? Meaning you've had the civil rights movement, you've had workers' rights, you've had women's rights. Is it really just stop partitioning people and just realize that human beings have things that they need to be valuable human beings? Meaning in order for that person to grow, to function in a society, to not be broken, you need certain things. And are we going to supply those things as a society and make human rights as one of our main things? I would argue that's the next plank. If there was anywhere to go, if we're looking for an ideology, I would say make the plank human development. Let's skip to Star Trek. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment, and we're going to be talking to Jim Jatras. So that should be a good conversation. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Jatras. We're joined now by our guest, Jim Jatras. He's a Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist, also an attorney licensed in D.C. and Pennsylvania, who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. And by the way, you can and you should follow Jim on Twitter, Jim Jatras on Twitter. You can also read his articles at jimjatras.info. And for those listening, Jatras is spelled Jatras. Jim Jatras on Twitter and jimjatras.info. Jim, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Thank you, Shane. Good to be with you and Jamarl this morning.
Good to have you back. I'm going to start here on a pretty high level. We could get into the election fraud, allegations of election fraud. We could get into Biden's cabinet picks. But just to keep a through line in terms of the conversation, we were just talking about the future of American democracy, the future of American political governance might be a slightly more accurate way to put it, because it doesn't seem like democracy has much of a future here in the States. I'm guessing this is something we agree in broad terms on, but I'm also guessing that we have slightly different visions about how things are going to go, how things could go or should go. I'm curious, where do you stand on that question? Where do you think American democracy first will go, just mechanically, statistically, however you want to look at it? And where would you like to see it go? If it's a return to something, if it's moving forward to something hitherto unknown on the world stage, regardless, what do you think is going to happen, and what would you like to happen with American government, Jim?
Well, I was listening to what was just being said before I came on about replacing with this idea of, different kind of civil rights and rights for this or that group with just human development, which is what's good for people in general. And I think that's a very sound notion. The problem with that is that under the current ideological set of assumptions we have, we cannot tolerate, it seems, any sort of inequality. That is to say, if you just sort of treated people like people, they're going to sort themselves out. And that means you can't go down categories of, race, sex, gender orientation, ethnicity, and so forth, and have absolute equality in all fields of endeavor. It just isn't going to happen. People aren't like that. And that by definition nowadays is wrong. That means somebody's being discriminated against or being given an extra hand up or something of this sort. And you can't just let the chips fall where they may. So I don't see how that works out in practice. I think as far as democracy goes, and keep in mind, of course, our founding fathers did not intend to create a democracy, because they knew that democracies inevitably break down into some kind of demagogy, some kind of mobocracy, where the many realize they can simply tyrannize the few and pick their pockets, and the whole thing falls apart eventually. I don't know what we do at this point when two halves of the country really, really hate each other and don't even live in the same mental and moral universe. When some people say maybe it's time to break this country up, maybe that's not such a bad idea to let the East and West Coast cities go their own way and let flyover country go its own way and have 2 or 3 different countries.
Jim, I think we're talking about this like a fish in water and pretending that the water's not there. I mean, when I'm making the argument about a human rights movement, I'm making the argument that humanity itself, not profit, should be the point. Now, I didn't put anything in that, meaning I didn't put any ways of being in that, because there aren't ways of being in that I'm trying to enforce. It's not pretending that people don't have differences. It's not even pretending that there aren't inequities that are created just by the differences in the way that people, this guy can run faster, that guy can jump higher. You can't really level that out, nor are you going to try to level that out. I'm just talking about, instead of having this dedicated focus to profit, that the focus and the understanding become the human being. And whatever you invest in that human being is going to come out. If you don't invest anything, that's also going to come out. We're pretending as if the levels of poverty and everything and the deprivation that people are experiencing on the planet is not somehow going to be revisited back to the planet. I'm just saying, in our country, we have all of these different groups that are pushing for these various movements. And I get it. In our mindset, we're not there. It's hard to even get there, and I don't even know how we get there. But this focus that human development, that if we want a person to be part of a community, that you have to make sure they have food, you have to make sure they have water, you have to make sure they have clean air, you have to make sure they're not drinking lead out of the water, you have to ensure that they're part of the community, you have to ensure that they have something that they want to do that feels like make them part of it as opposed to them being alienated. I'm making the point that those things are vital to just a person in and of itself to function, and that our society, if it focused on those things, it would be far better off. Now, to be fair, I don't know how to get there. I mean, do you understand where I'm getting at on that? Like, I'm not trying to make any kind of mythical or Pollyannish point of view of this stuff. I'm just talking about the focus. Does it make sense?
It does, and that's why I agreed with your original thought, and also raised the question of why others would object to it, because the inequalities would manifest themselves in that. I think one of the issues that you'd also have too is how, as a practical matter, how do you provide for that? Let's say put it on a continuum between, say, a more libertarian or a more socialistic way of looking at things. If you have a more libertarian way of looking at it, you're going to end up with the same, plutocratic interests that will manifest themselves and take control of the system.
But see, I don't.
Especially since we live in a corporatocracy. On the other hand, if you have a more socialistic way of providing for that, you have to rely on whom? The government, the wise and benevolent guardians, who will make sure everybody's provided for, and we also know how that works out. So I don't know, as a practical matter, you get from A to B on what I think, I agree with you, is a sound set of presumptions about what should be our goals.
Well, the government thing, it doesn't have to be this relying on government. I mean, there are worker co-ops, there are public co-ops. There are things where the public itself can come together to make certain decisions in regards to what's best for the public interest. I agree with you with the inequities, the paying for college or the elimination of student debt. Those things become fights, or even for that matter, reparations, and trying to get one segment of the society up where a certain amount of wealth is, like, all of those things become fights. So I understand where you're coming from with it. I guess I don't have this hard idea of, look, I guess for me, any level of freedom demands a certain level of collective action. The idea of libertarians where freedom is just, being left to your own devices, I think that's nonsense. I think freedom requires a certain collective that allows that individual to be whole. And so I do believe that it takes a society, maybe not necessarily this kind of strongman socialistic society where government gets all power. That's not what I'm necessarily looking for. But if it's a thing where the workers themselves have control of and more agency in regards to what they do and ownership of those companies, where they're making decisions on those companies, that's not big government. I mean, that is an idea of socialism where the workers themselves have more power and more agency within the context of the companies. However, that is not necessarily big government. I guess I'm saying there are ways to get us at least a few steps down that path. It's not impossible, even if I can't necessarily see how to get there. Is that fair?
Sure. And I think that also raises the issue of when we talk about a market, who actually controls that market? When you look at America, say, in the 19th century, there were, it weren't until the middle of the 19th century, big corporations, general purpose corporations of the sort that we know, and that in a free market personalist system, people in communities, neighborhoods, they even created the utopian socialist communities in the 19th century. People can do that. They can form collectives or cooperatives and that sort of thing. The question is when you get into a system that is so dominated by this unholy collusion between big government and big business, what room is there really for that kind of voluntary activity for people on a voluntary basis to provide for one another's needs? It makes it much more difficult, and I think we're actually moving in the opposite direction now. With the lockdown, with the kind of what we're going to have digital passports in order to travel, or we're going to have all sorts of controls. Maybe go to a cashless society where we all live in a fishbowl, and the authorities know exactly what we're doing all the time. I think what you're describing is unfortunately what we're moving away from, not towards.
I want to step in for a second. I can definitely see that. I see those worries. I see those concerns. What ultimately gives me some reassurance is the idea that in the same way that critics of socialism will point out that there's not enough competition, there's not enough new enterprise in socialist societies, capitalism ultimately outcompetes those. That's its own conversation. I want to port that conversation over for a second, or at least that idea to this one, where if we move further and further in that direction, what you almost inevitably get is stagnation. Stagnation technologically, stagnation politically. You get the kind of stagnation that over the course of a couple of hundred years broke the Roman Empire. And on the other side of that, whatever that looks like and however long that takes, there's always this hope that you're going to get some return to, if not normalcy, because I don't know what that is, some return to liberty, some return to, real individual, like you're talking about, individual local action. I could see that happening, and I could see that happening fast. And I'm curious, Jim, where do you see any room for that, or do you just think this is a one-way roller coaster? It's going to get worse and worse, or how do you think that's going to play out in the long run? Assuming for a second that you're right about it getting worse in that way.
That's a question I certainly don't have the answer to. And I think that's part of the divide we now have in our country today, that certainly a lot of the people who are supporting Trump and saying the election was stolen and all that sort of thing are from flyover country. They're people who still live in kind of a way, a legacy American social order. And still, things that the free speech, the First Amendment, all these things, the Second Amendment are very, very important. Whereas I think you have many more people in the urban areas, both, let's say, the poorer classes who are the recipients of government benefits and the richer classes who benefit from a kind of a rent seeking from the current social structure, don't see it that way at all. I think there are two very different mentalities in this country today. Those two are going to clash in some way before we get into the question of what happens after 300 years of stagnation. Yeah,
I hear you. And that could come soon. All right, you know what? I think maybe we can move on. Interesting conversation, but we've got a couple other things we want to talk about. And we've been hinting at this one over the last couple of minutes. The issue of the election and allegations of election fraud. It seems to me, Jim, like Trump has all but conceded at this point. The lawsuits notwithstanding, he personally, over on Twitter a couple of weeks back, basically said, at this point, for the sake of the American people, I'm going to start letting Biden's transition team come and start working with them, basically. It seems like that's been proceeding apace. Where do you see this going? I mean, we could talk about either the specific allegations and, the veracity of those, or we could talk about procedurally how it's going to work out and whether they're likely to pan out. Jim, I'll let you pick it up where you will. What's your take?
Yeah, I wouldn't have taken that tweet as a concession. I think he was looking at this, the kind of box that the GSA was in. What are they going to do or not do? Okay, fine, let them go ahead and do their thing. But he's still going to contest it. I would say maybe my own seat of the pants guess he's got a 25-30% chance of turning this around, maybe lower than that. As far as the allegations go, look, what can I say? When I look at media sources that are not approved by Twitter, the same ones that suppressed the Biden-Hunter story, for example, or allowed the Hunter-Biden story to get through. I look to me like the allegations are very real about the Dominion the machines, about what we saw in the videos in the Georgia with the ballots coming out from under the desk and so forth. I could easily believe that there is there was real fraud going on in this election that would have made the difference. The question is can they present enough proof to either the courts or to state legislatures to have them do the right thing? I talked to somebody who had very strong experience with the Supreme Court and said, even if you had absolute proof on a legal question that would turn the election around and win in front of the court, what are the odds that the court would come out on Trump's side? And this person said, well, under 50%. Even if it was crystal clear that's what happened, because the court would put its finger in the wind and say, yeah, but if we do that, all hell's going to break loose, and we don't want that. So I think his chances of pulling it out are rather small, even though I'm convinced that the election was, in fact, stolen.
Wow, that's pretty strong. I agree with your first statement, though, that even if they had flat fact proof, like even if, it was like the word of God itself, and it showed that this is evidence for it, would they turn it? And I don't think they would. I don't think, I think there takes a certain amount of institutional heft to make that work. Like when Bush v. Gore, Bush was on the in crowd. Bush was one of those guys. He was a Republican. You had all of those people basically on his side on that stuff. And the Supreme Court brought him in. And by the way, with the situation where Donald Trump has put 3 people on that court, do you really want to be the court to put Trump back in that office knowing that he put 3 of you on the court? All that stuff gets a little heavy. So I think I agree with that last point. Let's do this. Let's take a break.
Yeah, sure. But of course, that's not what a court's supposed to do. Even though Trump appointed 3 of the justices, and there's nominally a majority of 6 Republican justices, what they're supposed to do is what Robert Bork got criticized for decades ago, for simply saying that a court is supposed to call balls and strikes, apply the law as it is, let the chips fall where they may, not look with an eye toward politics. That's not acceptable anymore either. And I think that's part of the corruption of our system, that this old Anglo-Saxon notion of those guys with the knee breeches and the powdered wigs, that they should simply follow the written law, government of law, not of men. That's part of the thing that has been corrupted over the decades.
Okay, the voice that you guys are listening to is George Jatras. James George Jatras, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. He's also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia in Pennsylvania who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Jim Jatras, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. Follow him on Twitter at Jim Jatras and read his articles at jimjatras.info. Jim, thank you again for being with us. I'm curious. Incoming Biden administration, at least by appearances, I'll take the 65, I forget exactly what numbers you give. The 65 to 75% chance that Biden will be coming in here. What do you think of his cabinet choices? Just in a broad sense.
I'm underwhelmed. I mean, look, if we start from the notion that Biden, who basically is a husk of the senator he was for many years, and even then wasn't any great shakes, and Kamala Harris are simply the faces on the establishment that has tried for over 4 years to get rid of Donald Trump. That really what you're seeing is the return of the empire. The Borg strikes back, and these picks are establishment faces, but because it's a Democratic administration, let's put priority on, we'll have different kinds of faces to show how diverse we are, even though they're basically represent the same interests. Well, I think we saw this most strikingly just now with the naming of Lloyd Austin as the Secretary of Defense, edging out Michelle Flournoy, who is presumed to be the pick for that job. Apparently, the last choice was between General Austin and Jed Johnson, who was Obama's Homeland Security Secretary, because somebody somewhere decided that, well, no, we can't have another white woman on our little, racial, sexual rebus up here. We need to have a black person at the head of the Defense Department. So let's pick General Austin. And I think we've seen that up and down with his choices. We have an all-female communications team. Oh, we're going to put a Hispanic at Homeland Security. I mean, so I think what they're doing is playing the, intersectionality is a bitch. They're playing the diversity game here with what does the team look like when in fact they simply represent the same nomenclatura, the same entrenched interests, both corporate, of course, General Austin is on the board of Raytheon, the same entrenched interests that are happy as a clam that Trump will be out if that turns out to be the case.
Jim, it's well known, well established, that a black person being corrupt or a woman being corrupt is somehow better than a white person being corrupt. I don't know, but that's their argument, right? It's like, all right, this guy was on Raytheon, but he's black, so it'll be fine. Missing the point that the issue is that the guy worked for Raytheon. Like, it's this kind of revolving door nonsense, and they believe that if it's black, a woman, or gay, or trans, or hermaphrodite, that somehow this is a better mix. It's not. It's the same creatures. It's a continuation of the same ideology. Just because you have a different packaging on the outside doesn't necessarily make it better, right? I mean, that's basically what's taking place. Do you think he's doing this in order to try to cover himself from, let's say, criticism? Because the moment that you criticize, oh, you're being racist, you're being sexist, you're being transphobic, you're being hermaphroditophobic, whatever the thing comes up, it basically gives a certain degree of protection when the media is fawning over this interdisciplinary administration, despite the fact that they seem to not care anything about the policies that this interdisciplinary administration is going to be responsible for.
I'm shocked that such a racist thing would be allowed on Radio Sputnik for you to say that. Yes, of course, that's part of it. And now when we say corrupt, by the way, look, I don't know that General Austin is personally corrupt in any way, except in the usual sense that our corruption is sort of built into the system. In other words, that people aren't actually breaking any laws. They're simply engaging in the kind of, I think the term was rent-seeking, we've come to expect from our elites, that they're plugged into the system and the money flows, and that's simply the way things are. And yeah, we hear that there's a fight in the administration between the so-called progressive wing, the Bernie AOC wing, versus the Wall Street wing, which is, I guess, the Clinton Biden wing of the party. And I think that's a little bit of shadow boxing. That the corporate interests are very, very woke, of course, and they will play the game with, racial, sexual, whatever diversity you need to have, but just make sure that the money keeps flowing. And indeed, I think you're right that there's an element that if we can cover our money grubbing with a candy coating of diversity and inclusion, that basically they're immune from criticism. I think that's one reason the big corporations are so big in pushing all the critical race theory and feminism and LGBT and other ideology, because that's what prevents them from being criticized. Because if you criticize them, you're racist, sexist, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, whatever it might be.
I can see that, and it's cheaper. I mean, if you got rotten wood on the outside of your house, it's going to cost a bunch of money to replace it. If you got rotten wood on the foundation, that costs money, sure, too. But if you apply a paint job, specifically like a rainbow-colored paint job, that's pretty cheap. You can do that. It just takes a day or two. You just got to hire some labor in, and that's done and done. And similarly, if you have significant problems that need to be solved, and some proportion, some percentage of your progressive constituency will be appeased by bringing in an on the surface diverse cast of characters, then I guess you do that, because that's a lot easier to do than pushing through the things that people genuinely want, that are a lot more difficult to achieve: comprehensive institutional reform, fighting corruption. We've talked about healthcare, we've talked about education a lot in the past, all these different ways, all these different things. And I'm not even getting into how you would actually, what there is to solve or how you would solve it. Those conversations are, they quickly get controversial. They quickly get complicated. But what's not complicated is, like you're saying, putting forward a cabinet, a cast of characters in that cabinet who, you can easily shield from blame or scrutiny. And I hear what you're saying completely there. What do you think about the cabinet from a military standpoint? So looking at the foreign policy, looking at a sort of return to apparent normalcy after a Trump administration. Jim, what do you think about, you're talking about Florida for a second, General Austin. I don't think we mentioned Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan yet. What do you think? What do you think about them from that perspective, Jim?
Well, they're pretty much what I expected we would have, a pretty pack of warmongers that make Mike Pompeo look like Gandhi. Remember, if Trump, for his whole time in office, was trying and failing to get troops out of Syria, out of Afghanistan, out of Iraq, and so forth, you can kiss all that goodbye. We're staying in all those places, and I think the chances that we're going to have yet a new war somewhere are actually quite high. Trump, to his credit, is the first president in how many decades who did not start a new war on his watch, and I don't think we can continue with that luck under the Biden-Harris or whoever the real people behind this administration are. I think things in the world situation are going to get extremely ugly. I think they're going to get especially ugly with the Russians. That if you look at, Biden personally, but also others like Mr. Blinken in his administration, they've got a real animus against the Russians, and I think we're going to see that stepped up. We also saw an announcement from which of the generals we saw. I'm trying to think, it was that even after we pull out of Afghanistan, we're still going to keep 2 bases there. So what kind of pullout is that? I think we've reached the point where once an American boot is on the ground, it never leaves, because what we're really after is pursuing the program of global domination, and that will intensify under a Biden-Harris administration.
A weird off-the-wall question, Jim. Because I kind of want to get into the technology aspect of this and some of the people he's bringing in. Look, the Russia stuff, when Democrats were pushing the Russiagate stuff, my thought is, whether it's true or not, you're going to get a large number of people in the society, especially Democrats, that believe this nonsense, meaning they buy into the conspiracy theory for various reasons. And that energy doesn't evaporate. I mean, even when those things was losing in the court of law, even when it became clear that this wasn't what they said it was, and media had been presented basically false information for 3 years, it didn't matter. The energy was there. And the Democrats that got into office were going to bring that energy with them into the administration to be against Russia. And God, this is a hard pivot. But yesterday, the Jewish Post came out with an article. Former Israeli space security chief says that Israel and the United States knows they're aliens and that they don't want to communicate with Earth because humanity is a mess. Now, this one is a bit extreme, but some of the other ones that came out from like either ATIP, the new program, the UAP task force that's being put in right now in the National Defense Authorization Act, the information that was released by the Pentagon, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, the Navy, appropriating basic policies for people to be able to introduce this information, not to mention unidentified, and the associations that the U.S. military has now with Academy, or To the Stars Academy, which is basically an organization that is trying to get UFO information out to the public. Yes, that was a long intro. But I'm trying to make the point that the Congress has started to get hearings on this stuff and has started to get updates. Mark Rubio have even made the point that he hopes that they're not us. Because once he saw what the technology could do, he thought to himself, yeah, if this is another country, we're screwed. What do you think about this? And how do you frame this, even from the standpoint of this kind of being in the black and these kind of X-Files, and yet this information coming into the public sphere? How do you think of this as somebody who was basically a diplomat and has, been in this kind of governmental circles for a very long time?
Well, Jamarl, I, for one, welcome our new alien overlords. We'll see. I mean, I think if it's true, and it seems that more people are coming to the notion that something is going on that has been hidden from us for a very long time. And this is a very complex phenomenon as to whether it's even a natural phenomenon at all, whether it's something maybe coming from a spiritual world or something of that sort. But assuming there's something there, we may well be dealing with intelligence that we can't literally comprehend because it's beyond our intelligence. So what that means and the consequences of that, I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with Senator Rubio that we're better off if that is the case as opposed to some other country having other technology. We do know, getting back to Earth, that the Russians and Chinese and especially have been working on technology of an advanced sort that it seems our system is less able to do because our system is simply designed to feed the mouths that are already getting fed. So that means that we still have, aircraft carrier groups and things of this sort, even while swarm and drone technology is making that increasingly obsolete.
Jim, I'm going to have to end it here. I totally appreciate it. I totally appreciate you answering that because, this was one of those interesting things that was coming out. The voice that you guys were listening to is James George Jatras, Washington, D.C. based government and media relations specialist. He is an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia in Pennsylvania who has appeared before the Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. You can follow Jim on Twitter at Jim Jatras and read his articles at jimjatras.info. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's start here first, because this story is really interesting, and I don't necessarily want to get to it at the very end. I want to start in the beginning. Uber is selling its driverless car subsidiary to startup Aurora Technologies. Aurora, founded in 2017, said the deal will help it accelerate its mission to make self-driving cars a reality. Uber will invest $400 million into the Amazon-backed company, giving it a 26% stake. Now, full disclosure, I have NIO. NIO is a stock that competes with Tesla. They have self-driving cars and so forth. I also have weed stocks for obvious reasons. That I think, if any particular president gets in office that's not a Republican, they're going to do more on it. But also an avid user, very avid user. And so they always say invest in things that you believe in and use. Love for my self-driving car where I don't have to drive, and love my, bag of weed delivered to me in Maryland. I guess the point that I'm making here is the technologies that these guys are bringing forth are phenomenal. And they're transformational technologies. I mean, what does it look like when a drone delivers your package and then flies off? Person not needed. What does it look like when a driverless car pulls up to your house and then a little thing folds out, walks to your house, drops the bag off, rings the doorbell, and leaves? All of the stuff being to some degree automated where person is not needed. I'm making a point that on the positive side, you get this new wondrous technology that gets rid of labor, that gets rid of things that human beings don't necessarily do well or compete as well just because there's kind of this repetition, and allows it with the computers. This is the beginning of it with the Tesla stocks, the Google stocks. And yeah, Uber is not necessarily all that much in competition now, but they were at one point, and the Amazon stocks. Shane, what do you think about it? I think this is big, and I think these guys are making a play and putting a lot of money into something that they think is going to transform the way our society looks and the way our society functions, especially from the standpoint of the highway and the cars.
Especially because here's the thing, Tesla actually doesn't seem like a loss leader. Tesla seems like it's making a decent amount of money. I was talking with my brother about this, wise young Jack. We were just chatting about self-driving cars and different options here, and he made what I thought was a good point, which is if you look going forward in the next couple of decades, what are the two features that you're going to want in your cars? One is you probably want it to be electric by and large, especially if it's cheaper than having to rely on gas. And then two, with Tesla specifically, you are going to want autopilot. If that's a possible feature, if the safety kinks are ironed out, if it's getting safer and safer over time, if you have both of them in one vehicle like Tesla does already, then you're doing pretty well for yourself. And so I obviously a bunch of other car manufacturers and tech companies are following suit and converging on something that looks like what Tesla already has. That stuff's exciting. With drones, it gets a little bit murkier. Have you ever, just out of curiosity, have you ever flown a drone? Like one of the little DJI guys or something?
Not a big one. I've seen them flown and everything else, but I haven't navigated like one of the huge ones that have video cameras and all those things attached to them. No.
It's fun. I've done that. I got some beautiful footage of Twin Falls, different places around the United States. I kind of took one on a tour maybe a year and a half ago, something like that. They're fun to fly. That's thing one, and that's obviously part of why they've gotten a lot more popular as a sort of consumer product. Thing two, and I don't know how we're going to solve this. You don't want too many of them in the skies, and they're also just not as efficient as ground-based travel. This gets into a whole bunch of weeds about what exact kinds of transportation are going to be viable for what kinds of needs, which, would probably be an interesting conversation to have with a guest if we're doing a future-looking sort of, wide-ranging conversation like that. But broadly, I completely agree with you. This stuff is important. It's changing the face of our Earth literally, and I just hope that we can navigate the transition as skillfully and humanely as possible, because if we don't, I'll put it like this. Moving over to the military for a second, and I know we've got a bunch of headlines here. We're moving over to the military for just a second. It's a lot cheaper, and I don't want to put any ideas in anybody's head, but it is a lot cheaper, to invest in R&D in like assassin drones that can either just drop a bomb off and all you have to do is put some explosives on it, that kind of thing. This is stuff that people are talking about, obviously, and stuff that some people are working on. Specifically in different intel agencies, that's a lot cheaper than putting boots on the ground. It's a lot cheaper than sending up an aircraft. It's a lot cheaper than building an aircraft carrier. Heck, you could have, and I don't want to put, I'll cut it there because I legitimately don't want to put ideas into people's head, but this is definitely something to be concerned about going into the future. You know what I'm saying, Jamarl?
Yeah, let's say it this way. A nuclear bomb takes a lot of money to build, takes a lot of resources, took a lot of investment. By the same token, firebombs that the planes were dropping were just as effective. The houses were made of paper. And so it's like paper and wood. So the firebombing killed hundreds of thousands of people, like in one series of bombing. One is cheaper, just as effective than the other. I think your point is these drones and the technology is going to make killing a lot more economical. And especially if you have the technological know-how to pull it off. And this is something that I think we need to reconcile too when we're talking about aliens or UFOs. Like when Marco Rubio is talking about the technology and he's like, look, man, the quantum mechanics or some of the other senators, the quantum mechanics that are necessary to do what the pilots are saying and what the military is saying is taking place. You need to explain that to us because we don't have that technology. And so what happens when we do get that technology? What happens when we're talking about drones? What happened when somebody builds some kind of power thing in their house that can take down a block? Like, there really is a reason beyond just, people are going to go bananas of introducing the information. And where there seems to be trepidation within those communities with letting the information out. And part of the reason also stems here. What do people do with that technology once that technology is exposed to the general public? And man, I think that's where things get fascinating. One last thing, energy. So, oftentimes they like to talk about oil, and oil is a necessary commodity. The moment that you get lithium and the moment that you can create batteries, and those batteries get longer in life, the moment that the oil thing becomes almost redundant or just as a secondary energy source. Tesla also incorporates that. So it's like batteries, it's batteries, it's the electronic car, it's the flying stuff, like putting stuff in space. It's like all of these things, the AI, all of these things are all associated with the account and with the company itself. Yeah, it's
true.
It's a fascinating company. I mean, the houses in California, the guys would buy the solar panels. Great. And then it's like, well, what happens if it's nighttime? What happens if it's so forth? Oh, we have batteries. And so now you have a 24-hour energy system where the house basically pulls sunlight when it can, follows the sun when it can, appropriates the energy and keeps it for overnight sake where the person can just run it entirely on the system. It will be a new world. I mean, and I'm making the point that world is achievable.
We're living in it.
Yeah. I mean, we're living in it. It's just, honestly, it really does only take a commitment of saying, we're going to do it. That's all. That's all. Think of the jobs. Think of the things that are done in the United States when people are building a panel. It has made in the USA on it. And that person is doing that job, getting a great wage, and feels proud of doing it. Yes! Oh, here's the stamp, made in America. And I'm doing this because I'm making sure that those houses are going to have power. I'm doing this because I'm making sure that when I'm building these systems, that there's going to be food for people to eat that's dirt cheap and high quality. We're going to eliminate food deserts. Like, think of the feeling that people would have building those products, knowing that those products are going to be in the best interest of this country and doing it for infrastructure. We can do it. I think that's the most aggravating thing to me about this is it's this persistent image in my head of this is possible with the secondary thing of it's not going to get done. It's aggravating, man. I don't know. You agree with me?
But a lot of people don't want it. A lot of people. I mean, here's the other side of it. You look at the other like large scale sort of, and this would require I'm going to paint it in this worst possible terms. This would require an authoritarian takeover of so many resources. This would require a government to monopolize the use of certain resources, to do comprehensive R&D, and to do a bunch of things to get stuff done. I mean, after the 20th century, people are kind of fatigued about that, and for good reason, frankly. I can't blame them for it. I don't know. What's your response to that, Jamarl? What's your take on that?
What do you mean? You mean building the rocket? What else?
About a central government coming in and taking a bunch of resources to do some coordinated project.
But what?
I mean, because whether it's the
Central Government
Manhattan Project or the fascists or the Soviets, it's like every side of the 20th century has its hands bloodied.
I see, but come on.
Yeah, those are.
Those are different, right? I mean, like the internet, for example. Is the public really tired of the government coming together, pulling together resources to make the internet? I don't think so.
What makes the internet different? They gave the fillip in the beginning that got the thing going with ARPANET and everything, but the internet is largely privately driven, as far as I can tell, at least. You've got a bunch of individuals. That's the whole narrative, of course. You have a bunch of tech companies outside of the government. It's a sort of laissez-faire, Wild West system where people can come in and do what they will. And if it works and it spreads, then it spreads. And suddenly you have these massive tech behemoths. And even now, people are getting tired of that. It's like people are just tired of the concentration of power in too small a number of hands. And you talk about being profit-driven. That's fundamentally what I'm talking about, is the concentration of power, whether it's money or political will, the concentration of power in anybody's hands. I think we're, sort of justifiably scared of that.
Yeah,
What's your take?
I agree with you, man. That I agree with. I mean, centralized power basically means a rope corded around it, and you go away. The problem is that's like 40-50% of the resources on the planet held in like 4 hands or something like that. It's obscene. Let's do the news. Let's do the rest of the headlines. Because yes, like the topic is interesting. That's why I turned it around and did it on the first, because we were taking so long to get to it. Doses of the first COVID-19 vaccine in the UK were administered on Tuesday after British regulators gave an emergency authorization to the drug produced by Pfizer and BioNTech. The first 800,000 doses are allocated to people over 80 who are either hospitalized or already have outpatient appointments scheduled, along with nursing home workers. Others will have to wait, likely into the next year, as the UK gets more doses. The vaccine by Pfizer and BioNTech is still being reviewed by the United States and other European countries. Russia had a COVID-19 vaccine registered for emergency use back in August called Sputnik V. Russia health officials have been getting vaccinated in tandem with the official trials for several months. Teachers have been eligible also, including VIPs such as President Putin's own daughter. They've gotten the jab, as it's being called. The list is said to have a total of more than 100,000 people. Sputnik V or 5 offers 95% protection against the coronavirus. Quote, "We hope the vaccine is effective, but it's difficult to trust some of the figures," argued Svetlana Zavidova, whose organization monitors clinical trials in Russia. Quote, "We don't see the point of such a rush other than announcing how we beat the rest of the world. I think there's a struggle between scientists and politicians, and the latter are winning." Unquote. In the United States, many coronavirus pandemic emergency relief benefits are set to expire the end of the month. This list includes the following: Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. This program extended the regular unemployment insurance from 26 weeks to 39 weeks, affecting about 4.6 million out-of-work people. Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. Independent contractors, self-employed, and gig workers and other workers who don't qualify for unemployment benefits got up to 39 weeks of unemployment insurance under the CARES Act, affecting about 7.3 million workers. Paid leave protection. Under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, certain employers are required to give time off to people who are either caring for somebody who is sick or who is sick themselves. Renter eviction moratorium. A health order from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention allowed tenants nationwide who met certain conditions to give their landlords signed declarations to temporarily stop evictions or take the sworn testimony to court. Home foreclosure and eviction moratorium. For homes with federally backed mortgages from Fannie or Freddie Mac, foreclosures were suspended for single-family homes and for evictions from properties that are already foreclosed but still having people living in them. Student loan deferment. Student loan deferments were set to expire December 31st, but were extended Friday by the Education Secretary Betsy DeVos to January 31st. Penalty-free retirement withdrawals. The CARE Act also allowed for penalty-free early withdrawals from 401k and retirement accounts for up to $100,000. The normal 10% penalty was waived, and there were no mandatory withholdings. All right, those are your news. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, so let's go into the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Ted Rall.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And our guest, Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall. Also read his cartoons and articles at Rall.com. That is R-A-L-L, Ted. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Good. Yeah, thank you for being with us. All right, let's talk about Biden for a minute here. Maybe more than a single minute, actually. Where do you see the administration going with pretty much everything? I mean, what I'm asking here is, what do you think about what you're seeing in terms of the cabinet, in terms of the person himself, in terms of the dynamic between him and progressives? I'm just trying to lay the conversation wide open from the beginning here. What's your perspective, Ted?
Wait, there's a dynamic between him and progressives? It seems like, I was very pessimistic, as you know, about Biden and his willingness to work with the left and to pivot left at all. And everything I've seen so far has unfortunately confirmed what I expected. There still is not a single progressive who has been named to the cabinet. Most of the major positions have been taken. I was very displeased with his decision to replicate what Trump did by appointing a general to DOD in violation of a very smart law that prohibits former officers from serving in that capacity until they've been retired, at least out of the military for at least 7 years. There are plenty of qualified civilians to run the Department of Defense and have done so even under Republican administrations. But Biden is sort of going the James Mattis route. Policy-wise, it looks like very weak tea. I've taken notice of something I have not seen a lot of people talk about, which is the reversal of Trump's executive orders. Biden has a blizzard of exact reversals ready to go for January 20th. And most of my liberal friends are very happy to see that, but they're not thinking about the fact that a mere reversal isn't enough. It's just merely rejoining the Paris Climate Accord isn't enough. We need to go further if we're going to make progress. And just going back to the way things looked before Trump became president is not progress. Certainly the cabinet picks so far, Janet Yellen at the Federal Reserve is as Secretary of Treasury is so far what passes as a progressive pick. I'm sorry, someone who works for Brookings is not a progressive. So it is very disappointing, but not surprising.
This is basically woke progressivism. That's not progressive at all. Meaning, I gotta be honest, just because somebody is black, just because somebody is trans, just somebody is gay, whatever, does not make them a progressive. Just because the individual stands there. They're not progressive just because they're standing there. Like, it requires you to do something, to behave a particular way. It's not about what you say. It's not about whether you're black or color or anything else. It's about what you do. Do you believe that people should get health care? Yay or nay? If you don't, you're not a progressive. I'm trying to make the point that the Biden administration is basically getting the media to look at them as this kind of woke progressivism, as if this, a cornucopia of colors somehow denotes that these guys are lefties, not policy. I haven't heard policy come up at all in the conversations that the media's been having. They've just been lavishing, oh, look at that woman. Look at that black person that has never held that role. Oh, that black person is going to now be able to torture people like the other white people used to do. How exciting. And you make a point like, well, wait a minute. Does it matter? Policy? And it doesn't seem to. What do you think about it?
Well, it's an uncomfortable question for me as a white male to answer, but I'll answer it anyway. I think policy is really kind of all that matters. If we want to look at counterfactuals, look at the Bush administration. It was, by the standards of its day, relatively racially diverse. Condoleezza Rice as National Security Council, Colin Powell as Secretary of State. There were quite a few women in high positions of power, but they were using that power to oppress people of color, to oppress gay people, to oppress women. So what good did it actually do anyone other than just the symbolism? And look, the symbolism is not nothing. It was an important historical moment when Barack Obama was elected president. It was a symbolism does have effect, but symbolism doesn't matter nearly as much as policy. In terms when you have tens of millions of people who are suffering in poverty, disproportionately people of color, when you have people rotting in prison, disproportionately people of color, it doesn't really much matter if their jailer is also a person of color. What we need is a liberator. And if that person, the liberator, happens to be of any race, that's fine. We just need liberation.
It's this question of privilege. Oftentimes liberals use this thing of privilege in this kind of racial context. And that's always uncomfortable because honestly, the privilege is the people who can be liberals and say Obama is great. no issue. Or that, just like you said, the rolling back of the executive orders in and of itself is enough. Because for them, the world was great with Obama in office. And if we're being honest, it wasn't even that horrible with Trump in office from a material standpoint. It was there from the optic standpoint. Like, it's this thing of there needs to be more. What do you think is going to happen in 2024 if Joe Biden doesn't, let's say, try to knock it out of the park? Let's say the Democrats, Chuck Schumer, who's out there begging for attention from Joe Biden on the thing for college loans, is trying to get attention and getting people to vote and put him as the majority leader of the Senate. Let's say Schumer gets what he wants. And let's say Biden does what we expect Biden to do. Maybe he does the student loan stuff for $50,000. Maybe he doesn't. But what do you think happens in 2024? Is there a reversal? Does the public punish Joe Biden for getting in office and not fulfilling, let's say, certain expectations with everything is going to pot like this? We were reading out all of the things that Donald Trump and the Republican and Democratic House put in. They were extensive, even though they weren't nearly enough. Those things are basically going to go away. And the question becomes, what does Joe Biden do when he gets in office? And is it enough to ensure that by 2024, the public says, okay, fair enough, this change in leadership was exactly what we needed, or this was not what we expected? Like, what do you think needs to take place, and what do you think will take place?
Well, I think, the last two questions you asked are sort of, I'm going to drive right in between. I think the problem is that the Joe Biden is going to do exactly what people expected, and that the expectations are so low. And the question is whether people will look back 4 years from now. Will the voters say, okay, well, we should have expected more, and we needed more? And I suspect that they will. So, I mean, everyone I know who voted for Biden said, look, we know he's not a progressive. We know he's a neoliberal, centrist, center-right Democrat, corporatist, who, was on the side of the banks throughout his tenure as senator from Delaware. But we just want Trump out. That's all. We just, as anybody but Trump, blue to mother who, and then hopefully we can get him to pivot a little bit to the left. But, if he doesn't, sort of whatever. And that's, I think, sort of the general view of Biden. The problem is that the current state of the economy post-COVID is going to be just absolutely catastrophic for the foreseeable future, unless there's major amounts of economic stimulus if that's going to go in. And so far, that's not even on the table. Like a nice big fat $5 trillion stimulus package is really what the doctors ordered. And no one's talking about that even after January 20th. I think realistically, it's true that the Republicans led by Mitch McConnell are not going to let that get through. It's also realistically true that the Republicans will likely win one or both, I would say both, of the Georgia runoff elections, so that they will continue to control the Senate.
Let's take a bet on that one. I'll take a bet on that one. I think they're going to lose it.
Oh, man.
I think they're going to lose it. But let's keep on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I don't think so. I think that the Republicans. So I think that when you're. So the problem is when I think we're kind of in this right now. We're in the situation where we have low expectations of the system, which is a new thing. It used to be like, well, we're being let down by a particular party or by a particular candidate. Now, when you have a wide swath of voters who really kind of don't expect anything to be done for them to fix their problems. So you're getting drift not just away from the Democratic Party, you're getting drift, you're going to get more drift away from the system entirely, more apathy, more radicalism on both the left and the right. The center just doesn't have anything to offer. It kind of never did, and now it's readily apparent. So I think this, assuming that the system's still even around in a form that we recognize in 4 years, and I don't think it's going to be, it's going to be the lay of the land is going to be radically different. I mean, there are indications that progressives might peel off from the Democratic Party, whether it's this Movement for a People's Party or some other formation. On the right, there's noise that Trumpism might need to split off from the GOP. And there's just a general sense that the misery is just about to really get hard. So I think people are going to go back. They're going to rue this decision. And I don't mean the decision to elect Biden over Trump. I think they're going to rue the decision not to have allowed Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic nominee and then the president.
Oh, the thing is back in 2016, I don't know that it was their choice. I mean, 2020 might be a different conversation. We could talk about both cases. But back in 2016, that was pretty much on the DNC's end. They didn't let him through with the whole superdelegates, everything. Anyway, we got a bunch of stuff coming in. You were kind of touching on this, Ted, in your last answer. But specifically at the end of the year, a bunch of the forbearance on mortgages, on rent, moratoriums, that's going to end. And no sign of another stimulus package. Well, no sign of another stimulus check in sight. We'll see. What do you think is gonna? What do you think January, February, mid-flu season, presumed uptake of COVID cases? What do you think the political situation is going to look like around Inauguration Day?
I think it's going to be bleak. I mean, this is it's total insanity when you think about the fact that they're going to let so many people go, lose their homes. There's evictions going on even now, right now, despite the eviction moratorium, and not to mention foreclosures on people who own their homes. It's the economic situation that's going to really drive everything. We're heading into just a very, very bleak time. I was looking at the charts of coronavirus infection rates. That are high. We're getting more cases now than we were at the worst times this past spring. Hospitals are full. I need to see a doctor over something relatively minor, possible hernia. I can't get an appointment for 2 months. I mean, you can imagine what this is going to be like, by the end of January when Biden is presumably going to be inaugurated. I think this is going to be a president who's inaugurated with probably the lowest approval ratings of anyone who's ever taken the oath of office. Consider Obama took over in the middle of the 2008-2009 subprime mortgage meltdown, and he had something like a 62% approval rating at the time that he was sworn in, which means a lot of people who voted against him for McCain-Palin had turned around and had high hopes in him. That's not going to be the case with Joe Biden. He's impotent. He doesn't really want to do much, and he can't do much even if he changes his mind.
So let's do this. Let's take a break. The voice that you guys are listening to is Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at rall.com. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Peer into the future. With Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Rall. We're joined by Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist, talking about an upcoming Biden administration. Ted, do you think there's any chance that Trump is gonna pull this off and manage to, through election lawsuits, through hook or by crook, sit in the Oval Office in 2021, or are you pretty much just all in? It is Biden at this point.
None of the above. I don't think it's all in Biden at this point. I still think there's a 50-50 chance that Trump will remain president, but not because of 12th Amendment Electoral College shenanigans, which we will see a lot about today, I think, is the state certification deadline. No, I still think a coup is in the front of the president's mind. I think he's still terrified of being prosecuted and sent to prison along with some members of his family, and that is absolutely front and center of what he's thinking. I think he's considering some way to declare a state of emergency, declare martial law, keep us all in our homes, and claim that he's protecting democracy. And I think it's just, and this is not because of his psychological makeup. People say, oh, he just can't stand the idea of losing. I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think he just simply doesn't want to lose executive immunity. No one's offered him a deal. He wants to be free to do to live his life after he leaves office. And everything else is noise. Running again in 2024, the 12th Amendment, it's all distraction. He's playing for time. I wrote about this about a week ago in a column called December Will Be a Very Dangerous Month. And I think in the latter half of this month, during the holidays, would be a perfect time for a December surprise, for a police coup to be pulled off. I don't think it would be that hard to pull off, and I don't see much motivation for Trump not to try. So I think there's a 50-50 chance that Biden will take office, but
I think it's more than 50-50, Ted. I mean, come on. I disagree with you on this. And the reason why I say that is I don't know Trump's motivations. I would imagine ego, yes. I would imagine he probably is concerned about being arrested. And I think he knows he's not part of that in crowd where he'll be protected out of office regardless of what he does in office. But I think therein lies the point. He's not part of the in crowd. Meaning, in order for Trump to be the person to be able to pull this off, he would almost need to be that person who's protected when he leaves office in the first place. And he's not. And I don't know, I mean, even Barr, they call his henchman. Barr comes out and says, yeah, I don't see enough fraud in this election that would necessitate basically an overturning of the result. I don't think he has enough institutional support to back him up on this. He's calling states now. He's out here begging governors and people in the House, like in Pennsylvania, to basically try to overturn the results. And they are not there with him on it. What do you think, Ted? I mean, is there something to be said that they actually really don't like Trump, even though they feel politically stuck with him?
Yeah, I think they don't like Trump, and I think you're exactly right. I agree with you that he doesn't feel protected. He knows that when he goes, there are people salivating, and not just on the Democratic side, to see him in a jumpsuit and see him, arrested, and they want to print his mugshot on the front page of the newspaper. So I agree he doesn't have institutional support in a lot of places, most notably the U.S. military. But they'll stand down. They just won't do anything. He has remarkable support among local police, and the Obama administration proved that it is possible for the federal government to coordinate local police departments in a way that we don't think about very much. Back 10 years ago, when the Occupy Wall Street movement had encampments in hundreds of cities and towns across the country, the Department of Homeland Security coordinated simultaneous raids to violently crush all of these encampments at the same time. And they did. Now, all the major police unions, including in liberal cities like New York City, have endorsed Trump. We know that local police supports him. So if the question, as I see it, is if Trump were to declare a state of emergency over, say, coronavirus, everybody must stay in their homes, or there's a national security threat, we're going to war with Iran, you name it, whatever. Could the local police be counted upon to set up roadblocks, checkpoints, and enforce those measures? I think the answer is yes. And then the question is, how hard would it be to impose house arrest on political opponents like Pelosi and Schumer? I think pretty easy. It would just be, the cops would just be parked outside their homes and they would turn off their internet. I don't think, if I were Trump, I'd be thinking, well, I can go for broke and it might work. If I don't do anything, my only option is really to go into exile and, go hang out with my friends in Riyadh.
I know, Ted, but play this out. How would that work out? The cops at that point, the legitimacy that the cops have is not the gun and the badge. The legitimacy and the thing that makes that cop is not even the job per se. It's that the public has given a certain degree of responsibility and legitimacy to various political actors cops, in this case, in our society, have that legitimacy, not because of the gun and badge, but because at the very least they're upholding the law which would have just been utterly destroyed and ripped apart the moment that Trump loses legitimacy to be in that office and tries for a power grab. You're going to have people fighting cops. You're going to have cops getting shot because those cops have just lost legitimacy of being a cop. And the only thing that gives them legitimacy at that point is that gun and their ability to dispense force. I'm making the point that's the Civil War. The military and people who were in the military, the people with the guns, all of these people are going to get into basically a fight that is going to rip this country apart. Even some police stations are not going to go along with this. I mean, it just seems really extreme to me. Am I wrong on this? I mean, like, do you see where I'm coming from and saying that it seems hyperbolic to say that the president is going to pull a coup using the cops to basically lock up politicians and keep people in their homes?
Well, it is. I completely agree. It is extreme. But history shows that extreme things happen, and including in this country. I mean, the Insurrection Act has been used a number of times to suppress dissent in this country, and that's sort of lost in the fog of history. Just this past summer, the president wanted Mark Esper to order troops to potentially shoot at unarmed, peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters in the streets of American cities. The National Guard shot peaceful protesters in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. It's not just because something is extreme, which this is an extremely extreme scenario, doesn't mean that it won't happen. I mean, Wikipedia has a list of coups and coup attempts going back to ancient history, and it is a long, long, long list. Even General Douglas MacArthur kind of tried a sort of soft coup against Harry Truman after World War II. It's not completely unprecedented even here. So will it happen? Maybe, maybe not. Could it happen? I think absolutely it could happen. And just the fact that it's never something crazy and radical has never happened exactly this way in the United States doesn't mean that it can't. I mean, the Civil War was a very extreme event, and it happened.
Agreed that happened. Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. We will see whether or not there's a coup. I think that Jamarl and I are both, falling in the disbelieving camp on that end. Here's part of why I'm going to roll to disbelieve on this one, is that and this is going to sound like a pretty weird argument, and admittedly it is, but it seems to be all that the establishment media has wanted me to think for months, is that Trump is a vile enough figure to try to do this if the stops get pulled out, if he's about to get flushed down the hole. And I just haven't seen that. I mean, even when we were talking about why he was replacing key figures in the military, in the Pentagon, and in his defense team, as far as I can tell by appearances, it's to pull troops back. It's to pull troops, not to put troops on American streets. It's to pull troops back from Sudan, back from Afghanistan, back from Syria. It seems like broadly he is, if anything, the least militaristic president I've seen in recent decades. And so I don't, I guess we can just disagree on this one. We'll find out in the next month. Now, admittedly, if it doesn't happen, that doesn't mean that you are wrong necessarily. It just might mean that, he wasn't able to actually pull it off. Backroom politics, he wasn't able to get the coup done. But I don't believe that's going to come to pass, but we will see. In our last couple of minutes, I mean, you hinted at this in the last segment, Ted. There is no dynamic between Biden and progressives. Where does that leave progressives? It seems like right now there is a lack of institutional momentum. There's a sort of atrophication of political will in the progressive movement, if there is such a thing. What do you think that's going to turn into? We've been drawing some parallels and conversations recently between the situation in the States and the situation in the UK, where right now in the Labour Party, there's a schism that's breaking the whole thing up. There's room for something similar to happen in the States, but nothing, it's not happening. Could have happened back in 2016. Where do you think from 2020 looking forward, where do you think the progressives are going to go, Ted?
Right now, progressives are completely demoralized, and they are depressed. All the worst predictions and their worst expectations are coming to pass. And I think right now they're in wait and see mode. There's nothing much they can do. The election is over. I think a lot of people are waiting for some sort of new organization or political party to emerge. And I think a lot of progressives would then have to decide whether they want to split the Democratic Party and thus make it easier in the short term for the Republicans to win one election after another, or give up the dream of having a party that actually promulgates their policies and their interests, and as opposed to always playing in the Democrats' sandbox and getting sand kicked in their faces over and over. I think we are approaching the time when more and more progressives are going to see that there's really nothing in it for them inside the Democratic Party, and that they really do need to start something of their own. And I think Biden-Harris may be just enough to push them in that direction. On the other hand, if you do get some miraculously progressive policies, particularly, let's say, out of a Harris presidency, which I think would be more likely than under Biden, then that could forestall the schism a little bit more. But it's been a long time coming. I mean, it's been 50, 60 years, really, since the new left had a place within the Democratic Party. And so the question is, will there be a place for them at all going forward? I think very clearly not right now.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Ted.
Thank you.
For those listening, Ted Rall, that was his voice. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist, and you can and you should follow him on Twitter, Ted Rall on Twitter. Also read his cartoons and articles at rall.com. That's RALL.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're going to be taking calls on the other side of this short break. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, open phone lines in just a minute. We'll be right back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our phone lines are open. We are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. And we have callers. You can join them, though, again, if you want to, 202-521-1320. Anthony, calling in from Detroit. Anthony, you're on. What's going on?
Good morning again, guys. What's going on? Great show, as always. And I just had two comments today. One about the first about what the last guest, the conversation that was occurring about identity politics, and essentially it sounds like some of kind of what Adolph Reed in particular is concerned about at this time, and things that he's been writing about in recent times, and the subversion of real material gains for those disadvantaged or disaffected communities through identity politics, and leaders like Barack Obama and Rahm Emanuel and the ilk that is bred and proliferated through them being put in positions of power. And I think it's a big question about Kamala Harris, because you're essentially seeing the commodification of blackness and the use of it to cover up the exploitation of black communities and things. So I think I'm glad that was a conversation day. And my other comment, real quick, I'll get off the air for you guys. I would just please, I would beg you guys, Shane and Jamal, to check out. I'll tweet it to you guys. Check out my article. I have a newspaper called the Motown Gazette, which the first article has been published on the website, and it's so relevant to the conversation that we've been having today about America and democracy. And Shane, you brought up the point about America. It's definitely not a democracy. We can all agree on this as far as today. And I make in this article the point that I don't think it has ever been. To give you, big spoiler, I guess, to give you the gist of it, I make the argument that it is an ethnocracy in particular, a term that is relatively recent in the academic kind of. If you look it up, it's kind of recently been coined and everything. And so I take it from the situation that it's related to by the author that coined it in Israel and related to America, and as well as Black and indigenous and all the populations in America that have been oppressed and have been actually exploited and have been the back of what is not a democracy but is nothing but a system of subjugation.
I'll check that out. And just for those listening, Anthony, thank you for the call. No, appreciate you, man. Thank you for the call. That is, I found it. Pretty darn sure this is you. In fact, I'm sure this is you. MotownGazette.com. If you want to, you can go check out. Pardon me. See, there's a little bit of a sickness going on here.
Yeah, share it on Twitter so I can.
We'll
read
do.
it.
Yeah.
And look, I think the purpose of the argument is legit. I mean, if you have a country where the other people are subjugated in the country, how can it by definition be a democracy if the majority of the people aren't allowed access? I mean, women weren't allowed to vote. If you were poor, if you were Black, if you were Native American, you have all of these people who are basically existing on this territory, but none of these people, with the exception of one very small demographic, has the right to vote. And so it's like, even as that right to vote gets distributed throughout the country, I mean, we're talking about decades or centuries. And even then, you have all of these things that are put in place to make it that much more difficult. And one element of the country seems to have a huge amount of wealth disparity. All of those things allow more leeway into the political space. Yeah, I think that argument can be made and substantiated. What do you think, Shane?
I hear you. I want to read the article, and we got a couple of other callers. But I also just wanted to sort of put out his info. Anthony, MotownGazette.com. Check that out. We've also got a couple of other callers. However, our phone lines are still open. We do have enough time for you to call in if you'd like to. 202-521-1320 is the number. John calling in from LA. John, you're on. What's on your mind, man?
Hello, everybody. Hello?
We're here. We can hear you. What's going on, John?
Okay. Two quick things. One, first, and I think the brother's right on the ethnocracy, because that's what it is, that's what it was, and unfortunately, that's what it's going to die on. Second thing, and Jamarl Thomas, sir, I am not getting on. I love your enthusiasm about the aliens, but I think it's something you should know. I don't think you really want that. I don't think anyone really wants that. The only reason right now, if there's anyone out there has not come to visit us, is because, well, hell, I'm human and I can say it. We're too stupid. Only thing we got is water on this marble.
Well, a civilization that can traverse space, they can get water from pretty much anywhere. Look, I think you're onto something. I think any civilization that would contact us, and this is from the Jerusalem Post piece that came out the other day that the people were talking about, the Galactic Federation. Look, let's be very honest. Do you honestly believe it would be in Earth's best interest to communicate with anything outside of Earth? Let's be very honest. And even if they were trying to help this planet, what would it look like to us? You're going to have some people saying, oh, they're just doing this for these reasons. You're going to say, hey, these guys are not really benevolent in the way that they say they are. There's an ulterior motive. You're going to have other governments around the world who think that, maybe they're cutting a deal. Like, it just seems like it's impossible for this planet to engage anything else outside of ourselves when we can't even come together to ensure that everybody gets health care, or that the people on the planet, the overwhelming majority, are not in dirt poverty. So, it's like I understand the 2020 thing. I cringe at the notion of contact under these circumstances where we are now. Can you imagine Marco Rubio, Donald Trump being the ambassadors to Earth, to a galactic federation? Is that what you want? Nancy Pelosi representing you? Do you believe she's representing you now? And why would you believe that representation would become more or more honest when you're engaged in something where most of it is just in the black? Yeah, I mean, it's weird. It's terrifying. It's comforting in one way, but terrifying in another way. If there's a federation, that means there's order.
I don't want them, but
yeah, good. What do you think, Shane?
I'll
Does the notion of a galactic federation and they don't want to contact, but Earth isn't like, I don't know if you read the Jerusalem Post piece that came out the other day. It was a real piece. The guy's legit. Whether or not this is real or not, that's a whole second story. I don't take it as real. It could be disinfo as far as I'm concerned. I'm just talking about just what it means. What do you think about the implications of this? And does it make you concerned? Does it make you happy, worried? What's your thought on this?
I'll be honest. If it's true, it probably makes me happy because I like more sentient life, and there's also this idea of, to be blunt, there's this idea of the great filter, which is we ask ourselves, why do we not see life out in the stars? If you run the numbers, if you do the calculations, you should see intelligent life out there. It should be more prevalent than it is. Life in general should have been floating around for some time now. The universe is not old, but it's definitely not young either. And you should be seeing them. And so then you ask yourself, why don't you? And then there are all these ideas about different filters that different planets would have. And then you start asking yourself, okay, well, are we going to hit a filter? If we're not seeing sentient life out there, are we going to hit something? And so simply seeing, if there's one or more different origins of life in the universe that we become aware of, that's evidence for the idea that we will break free. And that's ultimately a good thing in itself, I would say. That's its own question.
Is it break free?
Here's the other thing.
Maybe it's this. Maybe it's break free or bust. That the life outside of the universe had to either organize their planet to get there, which meant either everybody on the planet gets conquered, or they find some level of peace in order to make it to the universe, or they destroy themselves. So the only thing that's floating out there basically is Nazis or, socialists. I'm joking. I'm totally joking, right?
I'm not sure about that one. A federation sounds a little bit more socialistic than Nazis, but anyway, no. But here's the other thing. We got two other callers. I really don't want to make this take too long. But here's the other thing, man. You're saying Marco Rubio, Nancy Pelosi. You're not sure that you want them to be our political exemplars on the galactic scene. But I'll put this question to you, Jamarl. What generation of humans would you prefer? If you had to go back throughout history, like, would you want a Cleopatra? I mean, you can think of who would you prefer? Because I agree with you. I'm not sure I want these people.
FDR,
but
William
looking
Wallace,
at the grand
Henry
stage
Wallace.
of history, you think FDR?
Give me FDR and Henry Wallace. Yeah. I mean, because keep in mind, even though the New Deal didn't contain African Americans, that was because of the time period. But Henry Wallace wasn't racist. In fact, he was one of those people that was an anomaly for his time period. He wanted to reach out to the rest of the world. He wanted to reach out to the Russians and whatnot and not have this Cold War. So if somebody who I had to pick just off the top of my head, it would be him. I mean, especially if we're talking about power.
That's your high watermark.
Yeah.
That's not too long ago. Interesting. Okay, you know what? We got two other callers. I just wanted to throw that at you, and that's an interesting. I can see that does fit. Thank you for taking the time to answer. We've got Joe calling in from Tucson, Arizona. Joe, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
Good morning, fellas. Hey, I think I am Jamarl Thomas's biggest fan. So it's the first news feed that I look for when I get up in the morning, and I just appreciate you guys, and I want you to know that first and foremost. Second of all, I am so damn flawed. I listened to your UFO feed, Jamarl, last night, and I used to be an eyeball roller when I would hear stories like that until I saw one. And man, dude, it was like nothing I've ever seen. It was a flying triangle, and it was huge.
Where was it? Oh man, you got to start off in the beginning for this. Where were you? I saw mine in Egypt, and it was in a triangle. It was this kind of light thing where it just blew up like this tiny little bit of light. It just blew up like the sun all of a sudden. And I was like, telling my wife, "Hey, turn right, look." And she looks at the last minute. We go under a thing where it goes away. And there was another one that I've seen. But where did you see yours? And what was the thing? Give us the details.
November of 2017. And 4:30 in the morning, I go open up my gate. I live out in the country, and I'm walking back with a cup of coffee, and I'm just looking up, and I see this thing. It's darker than the sky. The sky is not, it's not black at night. It's like a purple. It's almost like the inside of your oven, in those old style, it's almost like a purplish, but you could see this thing. It just did an elevator shaft up from the surface of Earth, and it went so fast, and then it flew due east right over Tucson, and it was like, I just kept on watching this. I'm like, what? I can't even believe this.
What did you think when you were seeing that? Were you able to reconcile what you were seeing? Like the anomaly of it all. What did it hit?
No sound whatsoever. And then, man, it was doing maneuvers over this part. I live in the west side of Tucson.
Okay, I love the story, but we have one more caller on the line that I want to get to before we end. Dude, thank you for calling in, man. Louise from Virginia. What's going on, Louise?
Yes, it's too bad I'm at the end. It's probably the Russians. They're way ahead of us, of the U.S. in space technology. They're probably trying to scare us into sanity. My question is about a third party. The Democrats have everything locked up because they're pitting people against each other, divide and conquer. We know how that works. And even if a third party gets started, it will be basically have a Marxist tinge, and Marxists fight with each other as to who's the more pure Marxist. So that makes them impotent in the long run.
Interesting take. Well, we don't talk about this. I could see some sort of a weird left-right wing populist coalition thing coming up. And we got to talk about that more some other time. But Louise, thank you for the call. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the show. Thank you to our guests. Thank you, engineer Andre. Thank you, producers Cam and Raheem. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. And thank you again for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. Signing off. Alt lines. Thomas.
Guys, I want to thank all of you again. Fault Lines. Actually, a really good show today. Really, really good show. Great guests. Great conversation. I was even able to sneak UFO conversation in. So, they say I look like a younger man when I talk about UFOs. I feel like a younger man when I talk about UFOs. But nevertheless, great show, guys. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this Fault Lines. You're probably going to see me a little bit later today. Definitely make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you share the video if you get the opportunity. Also, make sure you are subscribed. Google has been doing some weird stuff and has been basically dropping off subscriptions. So make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you will get that notification when I pop on. I want to say thank all of you for joining us, and I will see you guys a little bit later today. Thanks all. Have a good day.